I stared at my phone reading the message for the third time, hoping the words would somehow change. My younger sister, Emily, had texted in our family group chat, "Don't come to Christmas dinner. My fiancé says you'll ruin the whole night." Then came the reactions. 3 laughing emojis. That's what 35 years of being their daughter was worth. My hands trembled as I typed back, "Okay, have fun." I hit send, then sat in my corner office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, and let the silence swallow me whole. They didn't know I was CEO of this company. They never asked what I did. To them, I was just the invisible older sister who didn't matter. I thought that was the worst part of my week. Then the next morning, my secretary called. "There's a man named Mark Harrison here. He says it's urgent." Mark, my sister's fiancé, the one who wanted me gone. When he walked in and saw me behind the CEO's desk, he turned white and started screaming. Because he recognized me, and I recognized him too. Have you ever been erased by the people who were supposed to love you most? My name is Erin Daniels. I'm 35 years old, and I'm the CEO of Daniels Financial, a mid-sized investment firm I built from nothing over the past decade. To the outside world, I'm a success story. A woman who clawed her way to the top through determination and sleepless nights. But to my own family, I'm practically invisible. I'm the older sister who doesn't quite fit the daughter, who was never soft enough to need protecting, the one they forgot to celebrate. And on the evening of December 10th, sitting alone in my corner office, while the city sparkled with Christmas lights below, I learned once again exactly where I stood. The group text arrived at 7:43 p.m. I remember the exact time because I had just finished reviewing quarterly reports, and I reached for my phone hoping for something, anything that wasn't work. What I got was worse than silence. The message was from Emily, my younger sister. She had typed it in our family group chat, the one that rarely included me in meaningful conversations anyway. Her words were casual, almost cheerful. "Hey everyone, Mark and I talked and we're keeping Christmas dinner small this year. Just immediate family and people Mark feels comfortable with. Erin, we hope you understand it's nothing personal. Mark just wants the night to feel relaxed." Nothing personal. As if being told you're not welcome at your own family's Christmas dinner could ever be impersonal. I watched the reactions appear one by one. Mum sent a thumbs up and a heart emoji. Dad replied with, "Sounds lovely, sweetheart." And then Emily added a laughing emoji with the words, "Besides, we all know Erin's probably working anyway." A laughing emoji. My own sister reduced my exclusion to a joke, and my parents said nothing in my defense. Not a single word suggesting that maybe, just maybe, Christmas should include both of their daughters. I sat there in my leather chair, the weight of that silence pressing down on my chest. The city lights blurred as my eyes stung, but I refused to cry. I had stopped crying over this family years ago. This wasn't new. That was the worst part, the familiarity of the rejection. I could trace this pattern back 20 years to when I was 15 and won my school's Academic Excellence Award. Mum couldn't attend the ceremony because Emily had a cold and needed her. When I graduated top of my class, the celebration was postponed indefinitely because Emily was going through something. When I got promoted to my first executive position at 28, I called home to share the news. Mum listened for 30 seconds before saying, "That's nice, honey. Can you hold on, Emily's calling on the other line?" She never came back. I spent my entire 20s building this company, sacrificing relationships and sleep and anything resembling a personal life, partly because I loved the work, but mostly because work was the only place where my effort actually mattered. In this office, people respected me. They listened when I spoke. They didn't treat me like an afterthought. But at home, I was still the daughter who didn't need anything, the one strong enough to handle being forgotten. I stared at my phone, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I typed, "Have fun," and deleted it. Too passive-aggressive. I typed, "I understand," and deleted that too. A lie. I typed, "Why does Mark get to decide whose family?" and deleted it immediately. What was the point? Nothing I said would change anything. Finally, I sent a single thumbs up emoji. No words, no fight, just quiet acceptance of a role I never asked for. I turned off my phone and swiveled my chair toward the window. Manhattan glittered below me. Millions of lights celebrating a season I had stopped believing in years ago. Somewhere out there, families were decorating trees together, laughing, making memories. And I was here alone, watching it all from behind glass. I told myself I was fine. I had my work, my success, my independence. I didn't need their approval. I had survived this long without it. 2 days later, on December 12th, my secretary's voice crackled through the intercom with words that would change everything. "Ms. Daniels, there's a man named Mark Harrison in the lobby. He says it's urgent." She paused and I could hear the confusion in her tone. "He looks terrified." Mark Harrison, the man who had convinced my family I would ruin Christmas, the man my sister was planning to marry. And now he was standing in the lobby of my company, asking to see the CEO, completely unaware that the CEO was me. I took a slow breath before responding to my secretary. "Did he say what he wants?" "Something about an urgent investment opportunity," she replied. "He seems agitated. Should I send him away?" Every logical part of my brain said yes. Send him away. Let him find funding somewhere else. Let him never know that the company he wandered into belongs to the sister he helped exclude from her own family. But something deeper, something that had been quietly burning since that group text 2 days ago, made me say the opposite. "No, I'll come down myself." I stood up from my desk, straightened my blazer, and walked toward my private elevator. My reflection stared back at me in the polished metal doors. A woman in a tailored navy suit, hair pulled back, in a neat low bun, face composed and unreadable. This was the version of myself I had perfected over years of boardroom battles and investor negotiations. Calm, controlled, untouchable. The elevator descended smoothly, and I used those 30 seconds to steady myself. I had no idea why Mark was here or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. He had walked into my territory now. Whatever power he thought he had over my family did not exist within these walls. The doors opened into the main lobby, a sleek expanse of marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Our reception area was designed to impress, and it usually worked. Clients often commented on how modern and successful everything looked, but the man standing near the front desk looked neither impressed nor successful. Mark Harrison was a mess. His suit was wrinkled like he had slept in it or grabbed it from the floor that morning. His tie was slightly crooked, and he clutched an old leather briefcase against his chest as if it contained his last hope on earth. He was speaking rapidly to the receptionist, his voice too loud, his gestures too frantic. He clearly expected to charm his way into a meeting with some faceless executive who would solve whatever problem had driven him here. He had no idea what was coming. I walked toward him slowly, my heels clicking against the marble with each step. A few employees glanced up from their desks, sensing something unusual in the air. Mark's back was to me, so he did not see my approach. He was still talking to the receptionist. Something about needing just 5 minutes with whoever was in charge. "I am in charge," I said. He froze. His shoulders went rigid, and for a moment he did not turn around. I watched his hand tighten on the briefcase strap. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. The colour drained from his face so completely that I thought he might faint. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes went wide, darting from my face to the elevator behind me to the nameplate on the reception desk that read Daniels Financial in polished gold letters. I could see his brain struggling to connect the pieces, refusing to accept what was right in front of him. "Erin," he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Hello, Mark?" I kept my tone neutral, professional, as if I were greeting any other unexpected visitor. "I understand you wanted to see the CEO about an investment opportunity." The lobby had gone quiet. My employees were watching now, trying to understand why this dishevelled man looked like he had just seen a ghost. Mark's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, confusion, fear, and something that looked almost like panic. He had clearly expected to meet some older businessman, someone he could pitch and persuade. Instead, he was standing in front of his fiancé's older sister, the one he had helped push out of Christmas dinner, and she was the one holding all the power. I did not know, he stammered. I had no idea this was your company. The name, I did not connect. Most people do not, I said smoothly. Shall we talk in private? I assume whatever brought you here is not something you want to discuss in the lobby. He nodded, still too stunned to form complete sentences. I gestured toward the glass-walled conference room adjacent to the reception area and began walking, not waiting to see if he would follow. He did, of course. He had no other choice. Inside the conference room, I closed the door and took a seat at the head of the table. Mark remained standing for a moment, looking around at the sleek furniture and the city skyline visible through the windows. I let him absorb it all: the success, the authority, the undeniable proof that his fiancé's invisible older sister was anything but invisible here. Finally, he sat down across from me. His hands were shaking as he placed his briefcase on the table. He could not meet my eyes. I really did not know, he said again, as if repetition would make it true. When I researched investment firms, this one came up as a strong option. I never imagined that the CEO would be a 35-year-old woman you tried to exclude from Christmas. I finished for him. He flinched like I had slapped him. Good. I wanted him uncomfortable. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of what I had felt reading that group text, watching those laughing emojis pop up one by one. Erin, please, he said, leaning forward. His voice dropped and I could hear genuine desperation beneath the surface. Whatever you think of me right now, I am begging you to hear me out. I came here because my company is in serious trouble. I need help. I need funding. And he swallowed hard. I need you to keep this between us. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers, placing them on the table with trembling hands. Financial statements from the look of them. His eyes finally met mine, and I saw something there I had not expected. Fear. Real bone-deep fear. Please, he whispered, do not tell Emily about this. I can explain everything. I looked at the stack of papers Mark had placed on the table, then back at his pale, sweating face. He was waiting for me to pick them up to review whatever disaster had driven him to my doorstep. Part of me wanted to refuse to send him away without another word and let him drown in whatever mess he had created. But the larger part of me, the part that had spent a decade learning to read people and situations, knew I needed to understand exactly what kind of man my sister was about to marry. I reached for the documents and began flipping through them. The first few pages were standard financial statements, the kind any company would produce for potential investors. But as I dug deeper, the picture became horrifyingly clear. Mark's company was not struggling. It was dying. The balance sheets showed debts exceeding $2 million. There were notes about pending lawsuits from former clients, cash flow projections that made no mathematical sense. This was not a business seeking investment to grow. This was a sinking ship, and Mark was desperately looking for someone to throw him a life raft. $2 million in debt, I said flatly, not looking up from the papers. 3 lawsuits pending, negative cash flow for the past 18 months. I finally raised my eyes to meet his. You are not here for an investment opportunity, Mark. You are here because you are about to lose everything. He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. His silence confirmed what I already knew. He had walked into my company hoping to fool some naive executive into throwing money at a failing business. Instead, he had walked into a trap of his own making. I set the documents aside and leaned back in my chair studying him. Something about this situation felt familiar, like a melody I had heard before but could not quite place. Mark Harrison. The name tugged at a distant corner of my memory, some connection I could not immediately identify. Then it hit me. "Wait here," I said, standing up abruptly. I walked out of the conference room and headed to my office, ignoring the curious glances from employees who had witnessed our strange encounter in the lobby. Once inside, I went straight to my computer and pulled up our archived personnel files. 6 years ago, when I was 29 and newly promoted to HR director, I had reviewed hundreds of job applications. Most of them blurred together over time, but a few stood out for the wrong reasons. I typed in his name and waited. The file appeared on my screen, and suddenly everything made sense. Mark Harrison had applied for a senior analyst position at Daniels Financial 6 years ago. His resume had been impressive on the surface: MBA from a respected university, 5 years of experience at a boutique investment firm, glowing references. But something had felt off during the background check. When we verified his credentials, the MBA turned out to be fabricated. The university had no record of him ever attending. His previous employer confirmed he had worked there, but under investigation for misconduct involving elderly clients. The firm had quietly let him go before any charges were filed. I had personally signed the rejection letter. I remembered it now because it was one of the first major decisions I made as HR director, and I had agonized over the wording. I wanted to be firm but professional to make it clear that falsifying credentials was unacceptable without inviting a lawsuit. Mark had never responded to that letter. He probably threw it away and moved on to his next scheme, never realizing that the young woman whose signature appeared at the bottom would one day become the CEO he desperately needed. I printed the old file and walked back to the conference room. Mark was exactly where I had left him, though he looked even more anxious now. He had probably spent the last few minutes trying to figure out how to salvage this situation, how to spin his lies into something I might believe. He had no idea what was coming. I sat down across from him and placed the printed file on the table, turning it so he could see his own application from 6 years ago. His face went from pale to ashen. "Do you remember this?" I asked calmly. He stared at the document, recognition and horror flooding his features. That was a long time ago. I was young. I made mistakes." "You lied about having an MBA," I continued, my voice steady. "You fabricated credentials to get a job you were not qualified for. And when we checked with your previous employer, we discovered you had been let go under suspicion of misconduct." I paused, letting the weight of each word sink in. "You were investigated for defrauding elderly clients, Mark. People who trusted you with their retirement savings." He shook his head rapidly, hands raised in a defensive gesture. "That was never proven. The investigation was dropped. I never faced any charges." "Because you disappeared before they could build a case," I said. "You quit and vanished, probably changed companies a few times, reinvented yourself enough that people stopped asking questions. But the pattern is still there for anyone who looks closely enough." Mark leaned forward, desperation etched into every line of his face. "Erin, please. That was a different time in my life. I was struggling financially, making bad decisions. But I have changed. Meeting Emily changed me. I love her. I would never do anything to hurt her or her family." I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. Never hurt her family. He had convinced my own parents to exclude me from Christmas dinner. He had turned my sister against me before I even had a chance to meet him properly. And now he was sitting in my conference room begging me to keep his secrets while claiming he would never cause harm. You took money from old women who had no one to protect them," I said slowly, letting each word land like a blow. "Women who trusted you because you seemed charming and professional. Women who probably reminded you of your own grandmother. And you stole from them without a second thought." "I gave most of it back," he said weakly. "When I realized what I was doing, I tried to make it right. Most of it is not all of it, and trying is not succeeding." I stood up from my chair and he flinched as if expecting me to strike him. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, giving myself a moment to process the full scope of what I had uncovered. My sister was engaged to a con artist, a man who lied about his education, preyed on vulnerable people, and was now drowning in debt he had no way to repay. And in 2 months, Emily was planning to marry him. I turned back to face Mark, who was watching me with the terrified eyes of a cornered animal. "You convinced my family to exclude me from Christmas," I said quietly. "You told them I would ruin the evening. You made sure I would not be there." I took a step closer, holding his gaze. "Why?" His face crumpled, and in that moment I saw the answer before he even spoke. He had known. Maybe not consciously, maybe not with certainty, but somewhere in the back of his mind he had recognized my name, or my face from that rejection letter 6 years ago. He had pushed me away from the family because he was afraid that if I got too close, I would see through him, afraid that the woman who had once caught his lies would catch them again. "You were scared," I said softly. "Scared I would recognize you." Mark said nothing. He did not have to. His silence was the loudest confession I had ever heard. Mark left my office without another word. He gathered his papers with shaking hands, shoved them back into his briefcase, and practically fled through the lobby. My employees watched him go with undisguised curiosity, but no one asked questions. They had learned over the years that when something happened in the CEO's conference room, it was best to mind their own business. I stayed at the window for a long time after he left, watching the city below without really seeing it. My mind was racing through everything I had just learned, trying to piece together what it meant for Emily, for my family, for the wedding that was supposed to happen in 2 months. Part of me wanted to call my sister immediately to warn her about the man she was planning to marry. But I knew exactly how that conversation would go. Emily would not believe me. She would accuse me of being jealous, of trying to sabotage her happiness. And my parents would take her side just like they always did. So I waited. I went back to my desk and tried to focus on work, but the numbers on my screen kept blurring into meaningless shapes. I kept seeing Mark's face when he realized who I was, the raw terror in his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he begged me to keep his secrets. A man with nothing to hide does not react that way. A man planning to build an honest life with my sister does not show up at a stranger's company in a wrinkled suit, desperately seeking money to cover debts he never told his fiancé about. Less than 2 hours after Mark left, my phone rang. I knew who it was before I even looked at the screen. The timing was too perfect, too predictable. Mark had gone straight home and told some version of the story that painted him as the victim. And now my mother was calling to deliver the verdict. I answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Mum?" "What did you do?" Her voice was sharp, trembling with barely contained fury. "Mark came home, looking like he had seen a ghost. Emily is in tears. She says you humiliated him at your office in front of your entire staff. What is wrong with you, Erin?" I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. This was the script. I knew every line by heart because I had heard variations of it my entire life. Something bad happens and Erin is automatically to blame. No investigation required, no chance to explain, just immediate condemnation followed by demands for apology. "Mum, I did not humiliate anyone," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Mark came to my office uninvited. He wanted to meet with the CEO about a business matter. He did not know the CEO was me." "That is not what he said." My mother's tone made it clear she had already decided whose version of events to believe. "He said you ambushed him. He said you brought up old lies about his past and threatened to ruin the wedding. Is that true? Did you threaten to ruin your own sister's wedding?" "I did not threaten anything. I asked him questions about his business, which is failing, by the way. His company is millions of dollars in debt. Did he mention that part?" There was a brief pause, and for one hopeful moment I thought, maybe, just maybe, she would listen. Then she spoke again, and that hope evaporated. "You always do this," she said, her voice dripping with disappointment. You always find some way to make Emily's happiness about you. You are jealous because she found someone who loves her. You cannot stand that she is getting married while you are still alone, married to your job, pushing everyone away. The words should have hurt. A decade ago, they would have devastated me. But I had heard them so many times now that they barely registered. They were like a song I had memorized against my will, every note predictable, every rhythm familiar. My mother did not see me. She had never seen me. And no amount of explaining would change that. I reached for my phone and quietly activated the recording function. Not because I planned to use it against her. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I had spent 20 years being told I was the problem, and I needed proof for myself, if no one else, that I was not imagining the pattern. I needed evidence that every time something went wrong, my family's first instinct was to blame me without asking a single question. "Mom, I am not going to argue with you," I said quietly. "I am telling you the truth. Mark came to my office looking for money because his company is failing. I did not invite him. I did not ambush him. I simply told him I knew about his past." "His past," she laughed bitterly. "What past? Mark is a wonderful man. He treats Emily like a princess. He is kind and generous and everything you apparently cannot recognize because you have forgotten what love looks like." I said nothing. There was no point. She had already written the story in her head and I was the villain. I had been the villain since I was 15 years old when Emily's needs first became more important than my existence. "I expect you to apologise to Mark," my mother continued, "and to Emily. You have upset her terribly, Erin. She was so happy about this wedding and now you have filled her head with doubts." "Good," I said softly. "She should have doubts." The line went silent for a moment and I could feel my mother's shock through the phone. I had never talked back before. I had always accepted the blame, apologised, and retreated into my work where I could pretend the rejection did not hurt. "I do not know what has gotten into you," my mother finally said, "but I will not listen to this. Fix this, Erin. Or do not bother coming to the wedding at all." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, listening to the dead air, feeling the familiar emptiness settle into my chest. Then I stopped the recording and saved it to a secure folder on my computer. One more piece of evidence. One more entry in the long catalogue of times my family had chosen to see me as the enemy. I opened my browser and began searching. Not to destroy Mark, but to protect Emily. Despite everything she had said and done, despite the laughing emoji and the years of being treated like an afterthought, I could not let my sister marry a predator without at least trying to warn her. If she chose to ignore the warning, that was her decision. But I would not stay silent while she walked into a trap. I typed his name into the search bar and began reading. Most results were generic business profiles and social media pages that revealed nothing unusual. But then I found something buried on the third page of results. A local news article from 8 years ago archived on a small-town newspaper's website. The headline read, "68-year-old widow loses entire retirement savings to young financial advisor, case remains unsolved." Below the headline was a blurry photograph of a man in a suit standing outside a courthouse. The image quality was poor, but the face was unmistakable. It was Mark. 8 years younger, slightly thinner, but definitely him. I stared at that photograph on my screen until my eyes burned. Mark's younger face looked back at me frozen in grainy newsprint outside a courthouse where a 68-year-old widow had just lost everything she had. The article described how she trusted her financial advisor completely, how she signed over her retirement savings, believing he would help it grow, how she discovered too late that the money was gone and the man had vanished. The case remained unsolved because no one could find him. He had simply disappeared, leaving behind a trail of broken trust and empty bank accounts. And now, that same man was about to marry my sister. I saved the article and closed my laptop. My hands were trembling and I realised I had been holding my breath. The weight of what I had discovered pressed down on my chest, mixing with the lingering sting of my mother's accusations. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to think about what to do next without the walls of my office closing in around me. I went home early that night, something I almost never did. My apartment was quiet and cold the way it always was when I returned after dark. I had never bothered to make it feel like a home. It was just a place where I slept between work hours, a temporary stop on an endless journey towards something I could never quite name. I turned on a few lights and stood in my living room feeling more alone than I had in years. That was when I remembered the box. It was stored in the back of my closet behind winter coats I rarely wore and shoes I had bought for events I never attended. A small cardboard box worn at the edges, held together by tape that had yellowed with age. I had carried it with me through every move since I left home at 18, from my college dorm to my first tiny apartment to this penthouse that still did not feel like mine. It was the only thing I kept from my childhood, the only physical evidence that I had once belonged to a family. I pulled it out and sat on my bedroom floor, hesitating before lifting the lid. Inside was a collection of fragments, pieces of a life I had tried so hard to leave behind. A report card from 5th grade with perfect marks and no parent signature. A dried flower from a school play my mother missed because Emily had a doctor's appointment. A birthday card from my father, the only one he ever gave me, with the words, "You are stronger than you know," written in his careful handwriting. And at the very bottom, a single photograph. I held it up to the light and felt my throat tighten. The picture showed our family when I was 10 and Emily was 5. We were standing in front of our house on some forgotten summer day, the four of us posed awkwardly for whoever was holding the camera. My mother stood in the centre, her arms wrapped around Emily, holding her close like she might disappear if she let go. Emily was smiling, oblivious and happy, the centre of our mother's universe. My father stood behind me, one hand resting on my shoulder, his expression unreadable. And I stood slightly apart from the others, already learning to keep my distance, already understanding that I was not the child my mother worried about. Looking at that photograph now, I could see the pattern that would define the next 25 years of my life. Emily was the miracle child, the baby who almost died twice before her first birthday, the fragile daughter who needed constant protection. She had been born with a heart condition that required emergency surgery when she was only 3 months old. She spent weeks in the hospital, hooked up to machines, fighting for every breath. My mother never recovered from those terrifying months. She became obsessed with keeping Emily safe, watching her for any sign of illness, treating every sniffle like a potential catastrophe. And somewhere in that obsession, she forgot she had another daughter. I became the strong one by default, the one who did not need comfort because I never cried, the one who did not need attention because I never complained, the one who did not need celebration because my achievements were expected, not remarkable. I learned to take care of myself, to solve my own problems, to never ask for help. And my mother let me relieve that at least one of her children did not require constant worry. I remembered the day I found out I had won a full scholarship to college. I was 15, and it was the proudest moment of my young life. I had worked so hard, studied so many nights, while Emily watched television, and my mother hovered over her homework. I ran home with the letter clutched in my hands, convinced that this time, finally, my mother would see me. She read the letter and nodded. "Good," she said, handing it back. "We can save that money for Emily's future. She might need it for medical expenses." That was it. No congratulations, no hug, no acknowledgement that I had achieved something extraordinary. Just a practical calculation about how my success could benefit my sister. That night my father came to my room. He sat on the edge of my bed and looked at me with something like sadness in his eyes. "I am proud of you," he whispered. "I am sorry." Then he stood up and walked out, closing the door behind him. He never said those words again, and I never asked him why. Some silences are easier to accept than explanations that would only hurt more. I set the photograph aside and reached deeper into the box. My fingers touched something wrapped in paper, something I had almost forgotten existed. I pulled it out and recognised it immediately. A small box wrapped in faded Christmas paper, the tape cracked and brittle with age. On the front, in my teenage handwriting, were the words, "To my dearest little sister." I had bought this gift when I was 18, saving money for an entire year from my after-school job at the bookstore. I wanted to give Emily something special that Christmas, something that would show her how much I loved her despite everything. I had planned to present it Christmas morning, to watch her face light up when she opened it, but I never got the chance. That Christmas, Emily had looked at me with cold eyes and said the words that had echoed through my mind ever since. "Stop trying so hard, Erin. I do not need you." I never gave her the gift. I packed it away and carried it with me for 17 years through college and career changes, and every lonely holiday I spent pretending I did not miss having a family. I told myself I kept it as a reminder of who I used to be, of the girl who still believed love could bridge any gap. But sitting here now holding this unopened box in my hands, I wondered if I had been waiting for something else entirely. Maybe I had been waiting for a moment when it would finally matter. Maybe that moment was now. I put the unopened gift back in the box and closed the lid. 17 years of carrying that small package, 17 years of wondering what might have been different if Emily had accepted my love instead of pushing me away. But dwelling on the past would not help anyone now. My sister was about to marry a man who had stolen from vulnerable people, and I was the only one who knew the truth. I could not do this alone. I needed someone I trusted, someone with the legal knowledge to help me investigate Mark properly, without crossing any lines that might backfire later. There was only one person who fit that description. I picked up my phone and called Daniel Wright. Daniel and I had met during my business law classes, back when I was 23, and scrambling to learn everything I could about running a company while actually running one. He was a few years older, already practicing law, and he had taken me under his wing when most people dismissed me as too young to be serious. Over the years, our professional relationship had grown into genuine friendship. He was the only person outside my office who knew the full story of my family, the only one I had ever trusted with the painful details of being the invisible daughter. He answered on the second ring. "Erin, it is late. Everything okay?" "No," I said honestly. "I need your help. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" There was a pause, and I could hear him shifting, probably sitting up in bed. "Of course. What is going on?" I took a deep breath and told him everything. I started with the group text, excluding me from Christmas move through Mark's unexpected appearance at my office, and ended with the news article I had found about the widow who lost her savings. Daniel listened without interrupting his silence on the other end of the line, more reassuring than any words could have been. When I finished, he let out a long exhale. "This is serious, Erin. If this is the same muff from that article, your sister is in real danger." "I know. That is why I need help investigating him legally. I cannot go to Emily with accusations based on a blurry photograph and a rejected job application from 6 years ago. She will never believe me. My parents will never believe me. I need solid evidence, something that cannot be dismissed or explained away." "Lilol?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking. "The case you found in that article," he said slowly. "The widow who lost her retirement savings. Did it mention her name?" "No. The article just said she was 68 years old and lived alone." "Why, because I think I know who she is." His voice had changed, taking on the focused intensity he used when working through a complicated legal problem. "About 8 years ago, I consulted on a case involving elder financial abuse. A woman named Margaret Wells came to me after losing everything to a young financial advisor. She had trusted him completely, signed over control of her accounts, and by the time she realized what was happening, the money was gone. The man disappeared before we could build a case against him." My heart started pounding. "Margaret Wells, do you think it could be the same person from the article?" "I think it is very likely. The details match too closely to be coincidence. Same time frame, same type of victim, Same pattern of the suspect vanishing before prosecution. Daniel paused. If this Mark Harrison is the same man who defrauded Margaret Wells, then the case was never officially closed. It is still open, just cold. And if we can find new evidence or additional victims, the police can reopen the investigation immediately. I felt something shift inside me, a spark of hope I had not expected. How do we do that? How do we find new evidence? Leave that to me, Daniel said. Con artists like this rarely strike once. They develop a pattern, a method that works, and they repeat it until something stops them. If Mark has been doing this for 8 years, there are probably other victims out there, women who were too ashamed to come forward or who did not know where to report what happened to them. Give me a few days to dig around. I have contacts who can help track down financial complaints and civil suits that might be connected. Daniel, I need this done cleanly. If Mark finds out I'm investigating him, he will spin it into proof that I am trying to destroy Emily's relationship. My family already thinks I am the villain. I cannot give them more ammunition. I understand. Everything I do will be by the book. No shortcuts, no grey areas. If we're going to take this man down, we are going to do it right. He paused again. Erin, can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing this? After everything your family has done to you, after the way they treat you, why are you trying to protect Emily? Most people in your position would walk away and let her face the consequences of her own choices. It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself all night. Why was I fighting for a sister who had called me a stranger? Why was I trying to save a family that had spent 20 years making me feel invisible? The answer came slowly, rising from somewhere deep inside me that I had tried to bury for years. Because she is still my sister, I said quietly. Because despite everything, I remember the little girl she used to be before all of this. The one who would climb into my bed during thunderstorms because she was scared. The one who used to follow me around the house like I was her hero. My voice caught slightly. I do not know what happened to that girl or when she decided I was her enemy instead of her protector. But I cannot watch her marry a predator without trying to warn her, even if she hates me for it, even if she never speaks to me again. Daniel was silent for a long moment. You are a better person than most Erin Daniels. I will call you as soon as I have something. 3 days passed. 3 days of pretending to focus on work while my mind constantly circled back to Mark and Emily and the wedding that was now less than 2 months away. I checked my phone obsessively, waiting for Daniel's update, jumping every time it buzzed with a notification that turned out to be something insignificant. On December 15th, the call finally came. I found her, Daniel said, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. Margaret Wells. She is 72 now, living in a small apartment about an hour outside the city. And Erin, she is willing to talk. She has been waiting years for someone to take her case seriously. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by determination. When can I meet her? Tomorrow, if you are free. But there is something else. Daniel hesitated, and I could hear the confusion in his tone. When I spoke with her on the phone, she kept mentioning something strange. She said that years ago, after she lost everything, an angel helped her. Someone from Daniel's Financial, who worked after hours, took no fee, and helped her recover some of her money through an insurance claim. My breath caught in my throat. What? She does not remember the name clearly. But she said this person saved her life when no one else would help. Daniel paused. Erin, do you have any idea who she might be talking about? I did not have an answer for Daniel. Someone from Daniel's Financial who helped an elderly fraud victim recover money 8 years ago. I had no memory of anyone fitting that description, and yet the time frame tugged at something in the back of my mind. 8 years ago, I was 27, working long hours as I climbed from middle management toward the executive positions that would eventually lead to my current role. I handled dozens of calls and requests every week. It was possible I had helped someone without even realizing the lasting impact. The next morning, I drove an hour outside the city to meet Margaret Wells. Daniel had given me her address, a small apartment complex in a quiet neighborhood where the buildings were old but well maintained. I parked on the street and sat in my car for a moment, preparing myself for whatever I was about to learn. This woman held pieces of the puzzle I needed evidence that could finally expose Mark for who he really was. But more than that, she apparently held memories of someone who had helped her when no one else would. Someone connected to my company. Possibly someone connected to me. Margaret answered the door on the first knock, as if she had been waiting by it. She was 72 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. Her face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from years of worry, but there was strength in her posture, a dignity that had survived whatever hardships she had endured. "You must be Erin," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "Daniel told me you were coming. Please, come in." Her apartment was small and modest, filled with photographs and knickknacks that told the story of a long life. I noticed frames on every surface, pictures of children and grandchildren, a wedding photo from decades ago showing a young Margaret beside a man who must have been her husband. Everything about this space spoke of someone who had built a life around love and family, someone who deserved peace in her later years. We sat in her living room, and Margaret offered me tea. I accepted more to give her something to do with her hands than because I was thirsty. As she poured, she began to talk, and I listened without interrupting. 8 years ago, I was a different person, she said quietly. My husband had just passed away. We were married for 43 years, and suddenly, I was alone for the first time in my adult life. I did not know how to manage our finances. Harold had always handled everything. So when this young man approached me at a community event, offering to help me invest my savings wisely, I thought it was a blessing. She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the teapot. His name was Mark Harrison. He was charming, professional, always dressed nicely. He made me feel like I was making smart decisions for my future. He promised 15% returns every year. He said I could finally stop worrying about money. I felt my stomach tighten. Hearing his name from her lips made everything more real, more urgent. I gave him $200,000, Margaret continued. My entire retirement savings. Everything Harold and I had built together over 4 decades. Mark said he would invest it carefully, that I would never have to worry again. Her voice cracked. 6 months later, he was gone. The money was gone. And I was left with nothing but shame and confusion. "I am so sorry," I said the words feeling inadequate. Margaret shook her head. "I blamed myself for years. How could I have been so foolish? How could I have trusted a stranger with everything I had? But I have learned since then that I was not foolish. I was grieving, vulnerable, and he knew exactly how to exploit that." Daniel had been sitting quietly beside me, letting Margaret tell her story. Now he leaned forward. "Margaret, when I first consulted with you years ago, you mentioned someone who helped you, someone from Daniel's Financial who worked after hours and helped you recover some of your money through an insurance claim. Do you remember that?" Margaret's eyes lit up with a warmth that surprised me. "Of course, I remember. That young woman saved my life. After Mark disappeared, I was desperate. I called every company I could think of, trying to find someone who would help me understand what had happened. Most people hung up on me or told me there was nothing they could do. But one day, I called Daniel's Financial, and a young woman answered. She turned to look at me, studying my face with sudden intensity. She listened to me cry for 20 minutes before saying a single word. Then, she told me she would help. She stayed late every night for weeks, going through my paperwork, finding loopholes in my insurance policy that no one else had noticed. She helped me recover $80,000. It was not everything, but it was enough to keep my home. My heart was pounding now. The memory was coming back to me slowly like a photograph developing in water. 8 years ago, a crying woman on the phone, nights spent poring over insurance documents looking for any angle that might help her. "Your voice," Margaret whispered, leaning closer. I never forgot that voice, calm and kind even when I was falling apart. She reached out and took my hand. "You are her, are you not? You are Erin, the young woman who answered my calls." The truth hit me like a wave. I remembered now. I remembered Margaret, though I had not known her name at the time. I remembered it staying late, driven by something I could not explain, determined to help this stranger who had been so badly wronged. I had done it because it was the right thing to do, because I could not stand the thought of someone losing everything while I had the skills to help. And then I had moved on, buried in the demands of my career, never knowing what became of her. "I did not realize," I said softly. "I helped so many people back then. I did not know I made such a difference." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and before I could react, she pulled me into an embrace. She held me tightly, her thin arms surprisingly strong, and I felt her body shake with quiet sobs. "You saved my life," she whispered against my shoulder. "You gave me hope when I had none, and now you are telling me that the same monster who destroyed me is about to marry your sister." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Margaret pulled back and gripped my hands with fierce determination. Her tears were still falling, but her eyes had hardened with purpose. "I have waited 8 years for justice," she said. 8 years of wondering if anyone would ever hold that man accountable. "Tell me what you need, Erin. I will testify. I will do anything. That monster will not hurt another woman, not your sister, not to anyone." Margaret released my hands and stood up slowly, moving toward a closet in the corner of her living room. She opened the door and pulled out a large cardboard box, carrying it carefully back to the coffee table between us. The box was worn at the edges, held together with tape that had yellowed over time, but I could see it had been handled with care. "I kept everything," she said, lifting the lid. "Every email, every text message, every receipt. People told me to throw it away to move on with my life, but I could not. I knew someday someone would need this." Inside the box were stacks of documents organized with meticulous precision. Each stack was labeled with dates and categories, held together with rubber bands and stored in plastic sleeves to protect them from damage. Margaret had treated these papers like sacred relics, preserving them through 8 years of waiting for a moment that might never come. And now, that moment was here. Daniel leaned forward and began carefully examining the contents. Bank statements showing large transfers to accounts that no longer existed. Printed emails filled with promises of guaranteed returns and reassuring language designed to build trust. Text messages where Mark had called Margaret dear and sweetheart, using affection as a weapon. Every document told the same story of calculated manipulation. "This is incredible," Daniel said quietly. "Margaret, you have enough here to establish a clear pattern of fraud. This is exactly what we need to build a case." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "There is something else I need to tell you," she said, sitting back down across from us. "Something I did not mention before because I was not sure if it mattered." I looked at her expectantly, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change things. "Mark did not work alone," she said. "There was a woman. She would call me sometimes, claiming to be his assistant. She had the sweetest voice, very gentle and reassuring. She would say things like, 'Trust me, I'm a woman too, I understand what you need.' She made me feel like I was being looked after by people who genuinely cared." Daniel and I exchanged glances. An accomplice complicated things, but it also meant there might be more evidence, more witnesses, more ways to prove Mark's guilt. "Did you ever meet this woman?" I asked. Margaret shook her head. Only ever spoke to her on the phone, but I remember her voice clearly. She sounded young, maybe in her 20s or early 30s. Very polished, very convincing. When I asked Mark about her once, he said she was just someone who helped him with administrative work. But looking back, I think she was part of it, part of the scheme. I filed this information away, wondering if the accomplice was still active, still helping Mark prey on vulnerable people. The thought made my stomach turn. Over the next 3 days, Daniel worked tirelessly to track down other potential victims. He reached out to contacts in consumer protection agencies, searched through civil court records, and followed every lead Margaret's evidence suggested. By December 18th, his efforts had paid off in ways I had not anticipated. He called me that evening with news that confirmed my worst fears. I found 3 more, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had uncovered. 3 more women, same pattern, same time period as Margaret. He told me their names. Linda Park, 68 years old, a retired school teacher who had nearly lost her home after trusting Mark with her savings. Dorothy Kim, 63, who had been forced to return to work at an age when she should have been enjoying her retirement, taking a job as a cashier just to pay her bills. And Ruth Simmons, 66, whose husband had died 2 years after they were defrauded, never knowing that the comfortable retirement he thought he had provided for his wife had been stolen by a man in a nice suit with a convincing smile. Each story was heartbreaking in its own way, but together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Mark Harrison was not a man who had made one mistake, who had stumbled into fraud and then reformed himself. He was a predator with a clear methodology. He targeted elderly women, specifically those who were alone, widowed, or isolated from family members who might have asked hard questions. He built their trust over weeks or months, presenting himself as a caring professional who only wanted to help. And then he took everything they had and disappeared. I thought about my own mother, 62 years old, recently inherited $500,000 from my grandmother, living in a house with a husband who had always let her handle the emotional side of their marriage while he stayed quiet and kept the peace. She fit Mark's profile almost perfectly. Trusting, vulnerable, isolated in her own way, despite being surrounded by family. The realization hit me like ice water. Mark was not marrying Emily because he loved her. He was marrying into our family because of my mother. Emily was young, eager for approval, desperate for the validation that came with being chosen. She would not question Mark's motives. She would not look closely at his finances or his past. She would simply be grateful that someone wanted her, and she would bring that someone directly into our mother's life. I thought back to Christmas dinners past, to the way my mother would mention her investments and her plans for the future, never suspecting that anyone at the table might be listening with malicious intent. I thought about Mark sitting across from her, nodding sympathetically, asking gentle questions about her financial situation, building the foundation for a con that could take years to execute, but would ultimately devastate her. "Daniel," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper, "my mother just inherited $500,000. She mentioned it at a family dinner a few months ago. Mark was there." The silence on the other end of the line told me Daniel understood exactly what I was suggesting. "He is not after Emily," I continued. "He is after my mother. Emily is just the door. Once he is part of the family, once he has their trust, he will have access to everything. My mother's savings, her inheritance, maybe even her home if he plays it right." Daniel exhaled heavily. "Then we need to move faster than I thought. If he is this close to your family, he might already be laying groundwork. We cannot wait for a slow investigation. We need to get this to the police as soon as possible." I nodded, even though he could not see me. My sister was planning to marry a man who saw our mother as nothing more than a target, and I was the only one who could stop him. I stared at my phone for a long time before making the call. December 19th, less than a week until Christmas. Less than 2 months until my sister was supposed to marry a man who had destroyed the lives of at least 4 elderly women. I had evidence now, real documentation, that proved Mark Harrison was a predator. But evidence means nothing if no one is willing to look at it. Emily and I had not spoken directly in months. Our communication, such as it was, happened through the family group chat or through messages relayed by our parents. We had become strangers who shared blood orbiting the same family without ever actually touching. I knew calling her would probably end badly. I knew she would not believe me, but I had to try. I had to give her the chance to save herself before I took more drastic measures. I took a deep breath, found her number, and pressed and call. She answered on the 4th ring. "What do you want?" Her voice was ice-sharp and unwelcoming. No greeting, no pretense of civility, just immediate hostility from the sister I had once loved more than anyone in the world. "Emily, I need to talk to you about something important," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm. "It is about Mark." I heard her exhale a sound of pure irritation. "Of course it is. Let me guess you are calling to criticize my fiancé again, to tell me all the ways he is not good enough for our precious family." "No, I'm calling because I have information you need to hear." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Emily, Mark has a history. He has been investigated for financial fraud. He has stolen money from elderly women who trusted him with their life savings. I have evidence, documents, testimonies from victims. This is not speculation. This is real." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. I held my breath, hoping against hope that something in my words had broken through, that some part of my sister still trusted me enough to listen. Then she laughed. Not a warm laugh, not a surprised laugh, but a bitter, mocking sound that cut through me like broken glass. "Evidence," she repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "You have evidence. Let me tell you what I think of your evidence, Erin. I think you made it up. I think you have been looking for ways to ruin my happiness ever since I got engaged, and now you have finally found something you can twist into a story." "Emily, that is not true. I would never—" "Mark told me everything," she interrupted. "He told me you rejected him for a job at your company years ago. He told me you humiliated him in front of your staff when he came to your office. He said you have had it out for him since the moment you met, and now I understand why. You are jealous." The accusation hit me like a punch to the stomach. Mark had prepared for this. He had known I would investigate him, known I would find something, and he had built his defense before I even started my attack. He had turned my own sister into a weapon against me. "I am not jealous," I said quietly. "Emily, please listen to me. The women he hurt, they are real people. One of them lost her entire retirement savings. Another had to go back to work in her 60s just to survive. These are not lies I invented to hurt you. These are facts." Emily's voice rose trembling with anger. "Facts. You want to talk about facts. Here is a fact, Erin. You are 35 years old. You have no husband, no children, no life outside your precious company. You sit alone in your fancy office while the rest of us actually live. And you cannot stand that I found someone who loves me, someone who chose me because no one has ever chosen you." Each word was a knife precisely aimed at the wounds she knew I carried. The loneliness, the isolation, the years of building success while sacrificing everything else. She knew exactly where to cut because she had watched me bleed for decades. "That is not fair," I managed to say, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Fair?" Emily laughed again, harsh and cold. "You want to talk about fair? You have spent your entire life acting like you are better than everyone else. So smart, so successful, so above the rest of us. Well, guess what, Erin? Being rich does not make you right. And being alone does not make you wise. It just makes you bitter." I closed my eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. "Emily, I am trying to protect you. I know you do not believe me, but everything I am telling you is true. Mark is dangerous. He will hurt you. The only person hurting me right now is you, she snapped. You and your paranoid accusations and your desperate need to be the center of attention. Mum was right about you. You cannot let anyone else be happy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her about Margaret Wells, about Linda Park, about Dorothy Kim and Ruth Simmons. I wanted to describe the boxes of evidence, the tears of women who had lost everything, the pattern of destruction that Mark had left across years of calculated fraud. But I knew it would not matter. Emily had already decided who to believe, and it was not me. Do not come to Christmas, Emily said, her voice suddenly flat and final. Do not contact me again. If you try to ruin my wedding, I will never speak to you for the rest of my life. Do you understand me? The line went dead before I could respond. I sat in my car watching snow begin to fall on the windshield. The flakes were soft and white, drifting down from a grey sky that seemed to press against the earth. Inside me, something was breaking. The last fragile thread of hope I had held onto the belief that maybe somehow my sister would choose to trust me had finally snapped. I could walk away. The thought appeared unbidden, tempting in its simplicity. I could let Emily marry Mark, let her discover the truth on her own, let her face the consequences of choosing a con artist over her own blood. She had made her choice. Why should I keep fighting for someone who did not want to be saved? But then I thought of Margaret Wells. I thought of her tears when she embraced me, the way her voice shook when she spoke of waiting 8 years for justice. I thought of Linda Park nearly losing her home, of Ruth Simmons, whose husband died without knowing they had been robbed. I thought of my mother, 62 years old, with $500,000 in inheritance, sitting at Christmas dinner with a predator who was already planning how to take everything from her. I could not walk away, even if Emily hated me forever, even if my family never forgave me. I could not let Mark Harrison destroy another life. I picked up my phone and called Daniel. Prepare the complete file, I said, my voice steady now. Everything we have, every document, every testimony, every piece of evidence. I am going to Christmas, whether they invite me or not. The next morning, December 20th, Daniel and I sat in a small office at the local police station, across from a woman whose sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanour told me she had seen far too much in her career. Detective Sarah Miller had handled Margaret Wells's original case 8 years ago, and when Daniel reached out to her about reopening the investigation, she had agreed to meet with us immediately. I watched as she reviewed the documents we had brought. Margaret's meticulous records, the testimonies Daniel had gathered from Linda Park, Dorothy Kim, and Ruth Simmons, bank statements, emails, text messages, all organised into a timeline that painted an undeniable picture of calculated fraud. Detective Miller turned each page slowly, her expression growing more serious with every piece of evidence. 4 victims, she said, finally setting down the last document. Documented losses totaling over $400,000. Same suspect, same methodology, same profile of targets. She looked up at me. This is enough to reopen the case. I felt a wave of relief so intense I had to grip the armrest of my chair to steady myself. For days, I had been running on fear and determination, terrified that despite everything we had gathered, it would not be enough. Hearing those words from a detective, someone with the authority to actually do something, felt like finally breaking through a wall I had been pounding against for years. What happens now? I asked. Detective Miller leaned back in her chair. Now I verify everything. I need to contact each victim personally, confirm their statements, make sure all the documentation holds up under scrutiny. I also need to coordinate with prosecutors to obtain a warrant for his arrest. None of this happens overnight. How long? Daniel asked. 3 to 4 days, assuming nothing unexpected comes up. The detective paused, considering. That puts us at December 24th, Christmas Eve. I felt a chill run through me. Christmas Eve. The night my family would be gathered together celebrating without me, completely unaware that the man sitting at their table had destroyed lives and was planning to do it again. Detective Miller seemed to read my thoughts. If your information is correct, Mark Harrison will be at a fixed location with your family on Christmas Eve. That actually works in our favour. We know exactly where he will be, and he will not be expecting any disruption. If everything checks out, we can move that evening. Daniel nodded. What do you need from us in the meantime? Stay available. I may have follow-up questions as I verify the testimonies, and Ms. Daniels... She turned to me directly. Do not confront him before then. Do not give him any reason to suspect what is coming. If he runs, we lose him, and your family loses any chance at justice. I promised to stay silent, though. Every instinct screamed at me to act faster to protect my family sooner. But I had come too far to ruin everything with impatience. 4 more days. I could wait 4 more days. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment staring at my phone without really seeing it. The conversation with Detective Miller kept replaying in my mind, mixing with Emily's harsh words from the day before. I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, emotionally drained, hollowed out by days of revelations and rejections. Then, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at the screen expecting nothing important and felt my heart stop. It was from my father. 3 simple words. Are you okay? I stared at those words for a long time. My father and I had not exchanged direct messages in over 2 years. Our communication, when it happened at all, was filtered through group chats and family announcements. He had retreated so far into silence that I sometimes forgot he was capable of reaching out at all. I typed back slowly, I'm fine. Do you want to know the truth about Mark? The reply took 10 minutes to arrive. 10 minutes during which I barely breathed, wondering if he would ignore me the way everyone else in my family had. Finally, his message appeared. I know something is wrong, but I can't do anything. Your mother... The sentence trailed off. Incomplete, but I understood what he could not say. He suspected Mark. Maybe not the full extent, maybe not the fraud and the victims and the calculated targeting of vulnerable women, but he sensed something was off. And yet, he remained paralysed, trapped by decades of keeping peace, of never contradicting my mother, of choosing silence over conflict. I wanted to be angry at him. Part of me was, but a larger part just felt sad. My father had spent his entire marriage avoiding confrontation, and now that avoidance had left him unable to protect his own family when it mattered most. I did not reply. There was nothing to say. The next 3 days passed in a blur of waiting. December 21st, December 22nd, December 23rd. I went to work, attended meetings, signed documents, pretending everything was normal, while inside I was counting down hours until Christmas Eve. Daniel checked in regularly with updates from Detective Miller. The testimonies were verified. The warrant was being processed. Everything was on track. On the night of December 23rd, I sat alone in my penthouse surrounded by city lights that sparkled through windows I had never bothered to decorate for the holidays. I had everything a person could want. A successful company, financial security, professional respect. At 35, I had achieved more than most people do in a lifetime. And yet, I had never felt more alone. Tomorrow, I would go to my family's Christmas gathering uninvited. I would confront a man who had spent weeks turning my own sister against me. I would either expose him for the predator he was, or I would be rejected once and for all by the people who should have loved me unconditionally. I stood up and walked to my closet. In the back, behind clothes I never wore, was the memory box from my childhood. I opened it and reached inside my fingers, finding the small wrapped package at the bottom. The Christmas gift I had bought for Emily when I was 18. 17 years of carrying it with me, 17 years of hope that someday things would be different. I held it in my hands, feeling its weight, remembering the girl I used to be, the girl who believed love could fix anything, the girl who saved money for a year to buy her sister a gift that was never opened. Maybe tomorrow would end in disaster. Maybe Emily would never forgive me. Maybe my family would cut me off forever. But I was done hiding. I was done being invisible. I was done accepting rejection as the price of belonging. I put the small box in my purse and whispered to the empty room, "It is time." Christmas morning arrived cold and grey, the kind of winter day where the sky presses down like a heavy blanket and the air bites at any exposed skin. I woke before dawn, not because I had slept well, but because I had barely slept at all. My mind had been racing through every possible scenario, every way this day could unfold, every word I might need to say. I showered, dressed carefully in a dark blue suit that made me feel armoured, and checked my purse one final time. Inside was everything I needed. The briefcase Daniel had prepared sat by the door, filled with copies of every document we had gathered. And tucked into a side pocket of my purse was the small, wrapped box the 17-year-old gift that had travelled with me through every chapter of my adult life. The drive to Emily's house took 45 minutes. She and Mark had moved into a suburban home 6 months ago, a charming 2-story place in a neighbourhood filled with families and holiday decorations. As I turned onto her street, I could see the house from a distance, lit up like something from a Christmas card. Lights outlined the roof and windows. A wreath hung on the front door. Through the large front window, I could see the glow of a Christmas tree, its lights twinkling against the grey morning. It looked perfect. It looked like everything I had never had. I parked on the street and sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct told me to turn around, to drive away, to let this family that had rejected me so many times continue on without my interference. But I thought of Margaret Wells and her box of evidence. I thought of Linda Park and Dorothy Kim and Ruth Simmons. I thought of my mother sitting inside that beautiful house with no idea that the man her daughter was about to marry had already started calculating how to take everything from her. I got out of the car, grabbed my briefcase, and walked up the path to the front door. The doorbell chimed with a cheerful melody that felt almost mocking given what was about to happen. I heard footsteps approaching, and then the door swung open. Emily stood there in a red sweater and black pants. Her hair styled her makeup perfect. For one frozen second, she looked exactly like the little sister I remembered from childhood, the girl who used to follow me around the house and beg me to read her stories. Then, recognition hit, and all the warmth drained from her face. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Merry Christmas, Emily," I said calmly. Before she could respond, my mother appeared behind her. Patricia Daniels was 62 years old, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant twist, her expression shifting from curiosity to fury in the span of a heartbeat. "I told you not to come," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "How dare you show up here after everything you have done?" I did not flinch. I had prepared for this. "This is Christmas," I said, stepping forward. "I am family. Or have you forgotten?" They parted almost involuntarily, too shocked by my boldness to physically block me. I walked past them into the foyer, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, like every idealized Christmas memory I had never been allowed to be part of. I could hear music playing softly from somewhere deeper inside carols about joy and peace and goodwill. The irony was almost too much to bear. I turned the corner into the living room and stopped. There he was, Mark Harrison, standing by the fireplace in a dark green sweater, a glass of something amber in his hand. He had been laughing at something, his face arranged in that charming smile that had fooled so many people. But the moment he saw me, the smile froze and then shattered. His face went pale. His hand tightened around the glass until his knuckles turned white. I watched him try to recover, try to reassemble the mask he wore so well, but his body betrayed him. His shoulders tensed, his breathing quickened. He had not expected me to actually come. He had been so confident, that Emily's rejection would keep me away, that I would retreat into silence like I always had. He had underestimated me. My father sat on the sofa near the tree, a newspaper open in his lap, though I doubted he had been reading it. When I walked in, he looked up at me with an expression I could not quite decipher. There was surprise there, certainly, but also something else. Something that might have been relief, or might have been dread, or might have been both at once. "Erin," he said quietly, neither welcoming nor condemning. "Dad," I replied, holding his gaze for just a moment before turning my attention to the room at large. The space was beautiful, I had to admit. The tree was enormous, covered in ornaments and lights. Presents were stacked beneath it in neat piles. The dining table beyond the living room was set with fine china and crystal glasses ready for the feast that was supposed to bring this family together. Everything looked exactly right, exactly perfect, exactly like the Christmas celebrations I had been excluded from for years. But the air was wrong. The tension was so thick I could almost taste it. Emily had followed me in, standing near the doorway, with her arms crossed, her face flushed with anger. My mother positioned herself between me and the rest of the room, as if physically blocking me could undo my presence. Mark stood frozen by the fireplace, his charm completely gone, replaced by the barely concealed panic of a cornered animal. Only I was calm. Only I knew what was coming. "Erin, you need to leave," my mother said, her voice hard. "You are not invited. You are not welcome here." I ignored her. Instead, I walked to the dining table and set my briefcase down on the pristine white tablecloth, right next to the crystal centerpiece filled with red ornaments and holly. "I will leave soon enough," I said, turning to face all of them. "But first, there is something this family needs to see." Mark's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The sound of shattering glass seemed to hang in the air, long after the pieces had scattered across the floor. Mark stood frozen, staring at the broken shards at his feet, his face the colour of old paper. No one moved to clean it up. No one moved at all. I opened my briefcase and began removing documents, placing them one by one on the dining table with deliberate calm. Financial statements, bank records, legal filings. Each page was a piece of a puzzle that would soon reveal a picture none of them wanted to see. On December 12th, I began, my voice steady. Mark came to my office, not to visit his future sister-in-law, not to wish me happy holidays. He came because he was desperate for money. Mark finally found his voice. "That is not true. I went to discuss a potential business partnership. Erin is twisting everything." I ignored him and continued. "His company is $2 million in debt. He is facing multiple lawsuits from former clients. He came to Daniels Financial because he had heard it was a successful firm with capital to invest. He had no idea the CEO was me." I placed the first stack of documents on the table. Balance sheets showing massive losses, letters from creditors demanding payment, court filings for pending litigation. The evidence was undeniable for anyone willing to look. Emily stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "She is lying. Mark's business is doing great. He just landed a huge contract last month. He told me everything is fine." "Then, why did he come to my office begging for investment capital?" I asked calmly. "Why did he look like he was going to pass out when he realised who I was?" My mother moved to stand beside Emily, forming a united front. "This is exactly what you do, Erin. You make up stories to get attention. You twist things to make yourself look important. I will not stand here and listen to you slander the man my daughter loves." I had expected this. I had prepared for the denial, the accusations, the immediate assumption that I was the villain. It still hurt, but I did not let it show. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. "I recorded our conversation," I said simply. Mark begged me not to tell Emily about his visit. He was terrified. He admitted everything. The room went very still. Mark's face shifted from denial to something closer to panic. You had no right to record me. That is illegal. Actually, in this state, only one party needs to consent to a recording. I consented. I held up my phone. Would you like to hear what you said? Before anyone could object, I pressed play. Mark's voice filled the room thin and desperate, stripped of all the charm he usually projected. Please, do not tell Emily about this. I can explain everything. My company is going through a rough patch, that is all. I just need some time to turn things around. If Emily finds out, if she thinks I am failing... I let the recording continue. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the lies he had built. He talked about his debts. He talked about his fear of losing Emily. He talked about how he could not let anyone know how bad things had gotten. His voice cracked multiple times, the sound of a man whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling. When the recording ended, the silence was deafening. Emily stood motionless, her face pale, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. My mother had pressed her hand against her mouth, her earlier anger replaced by something more uncertain. My father remained on the sofa watching everything with that same unreadable expression. And Mark looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in slow motion. I can explain, he said quickly, stepping toward Emily. Yes, the business is struggling. I did not want to tell you because I was ashamed. I wanted to protect you from worrying. But that is all it is. A temporary setback. I am working on solutions. Emily did not look at him. She was staring at the documents on the table, at the financial statements that contradicted everything he had told her. You said the business was fine, she said quietly. Last week, you said you had just signed 3 new clients. You said we would be financially secure for years. We will be, Mark insisted. I just need more time. These numbers are from months ago. Things have improved since then. They have not improved? I said, pulling out another document. This is a bank statement from last week. Your company account has less than $8,000 in it. You have payroll due in 3 days that you cannot cover. Mark's composure finally shattered. Why are you doing this? Sonia, he shouted at me. Why do you want to destroy my life? Is it because I am marrying Emily? Is it because you cannot stand that someone in this family is actually happy? I met his gaze without flinching. This is not about happiness. This is about truth. And the truth is that you have been lying to my sister from the moment you met her. Emily finally turned to look at Mark. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. Not yet. She looked at him the way you look at a stranger you thought you knew, searching for some trace of the person you believed in. You told me the business was fine, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Every time I asked, you said everything was under control. You said I did not need to worry about money. You said you had big clients, important contracts, a solid foundation. Mark reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Emily, please, I was trying to protect you. I did not want you to be stressed about finances before the wedding. I thought I could fix everything before you needed to know. Fix it how? Emily's voice cracked. With $2 million in debt, with lawsuits against you. How were you planning to fix that without telling me? Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. The excuses he had prepared, the explanations he had rehearsed, all seemed to desert him at once. Emily turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself, as if trying to hold her own body together. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft I almost did not hear her. I knew something was wrong, she whispered. I knew it. There were signs. Phone calls he would not take in front of me. Documents he hid when I walked into the room. Times when he would disappear for hours and come back looking exhausted. She looked up at my mother, then at me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself he loved me, and that was enough. The room had shifted. I could feel it. The united front against me was fracturing doubt seeping in through the cracks I had created. Mark stood alone now, separated from the family that had welcomed him, so warmly exposed as something far less than the man he had pretended to be. But this was just the beginning. The financial lies were only the surface. The real horror was still waiting to be revealed. Emily's whispered admission hung in the air like smoke after a fire. I knew something was wrong. The words echoed through my mind as I tried to process what she had just said. All the anger I had been carrying, all the righteousness of exposing Mark's lies, suddenly felt more complicated. My mother stepped toward Emily, her face creased with confusion. "What do you mean? You knew? How could you have known?" Emily did not look at any of us. She was staring at the Christmas tree, at the twinkling lights and carefully wrapped presents beneath it, as if searching for something familiar to anchor herself to. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. 3 months ago, I found documents in Mark's briefcase, bank statements, letters from creditors, things he had been hiding from me. I confronted him that night. She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. He broke down. He told me everything about the debt, about the lawsuits, about how close he was to losing everything. He cried and said he was ashamed that he did not want me to think less of him. He promised he would fix it. He just needed a time. The room went completely silent. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of cars passing on the street outside. My mother's face had gone slack with shock. My father had lowered his newspaper entirely, watching Emily with an expression of dawning horror. "You knew," I said slowly, the words tasting strange in my mouth. "You knew he was lying about his finances, and you still planned to marry him." Emily finally turned to face me, and the pain in her eyes was so raw that for a moment I forgot all the cruel things she had said to me over the years. She looked like the little girl I remembered, the one who cried when she scraped her knee and reached for me to make it better. "You do not understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I am 30 years old. Every holiday Mum asks when I'm getting married. Every family dinner she reminds me that my biological clock is ticking. Every time I visit, she shows me pictures of her friends' grandchildren and sighs about how she will probably never have any." She was sobbing now, the words tumbling out between gasps. Mark was the first man who said he loved me and meant it, the first one who wanted to build a life with me. I could not lose him. I could not go back to being the unmarried daughter, the disappointment, the failure. My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. She reached out toward Emily but stopped short, her hand hovering in the air as if she did not know whether she had the right to offer comfort anymore. "Emily," she whispered, I did not mean to." "Yes, you did." Emily said the words coming out harsh and bitter. "You have been asking me when I would find a husband since I turned 25. You compared me to every cousin and family friend who got married before me. You made me feel like I was worthless until I had a ring on my finger." She laughed, a horrible broken sound. "Well, congratulations, Mum. I found someone, and I was so desperate to keep him that I was willing to ignore the truth." I watched my mother's face crumble. For 20 years she had poured all her attention and protection into Emily, convinced that her younger daughter was fragile, that she needed shielding from the harshness of the world. And now she was seeing the result of that obsessive love. Emily had not grown stronger under her protection. She had grown so desperate for approval that she would marry a liar rather than face disappointment. The favoritism that had hurt me so deeply had hurt Emily too, just in a different way. Emily turned to me then, and I saw something unexpected in her eyes. Not just pain, but envy, a deep, corrosive envy that had apparently been festering for years. "You do not get to judge me," she said, her voice rising. "You have no idea what it is like to feel inadequate every single day. You built a company by the time you were 35. You are successful, respected, independent. Everyone talks about how impressive you are, how smart, how driven. You never needed anyone's approval because you created your own worth." I opened my mouth to respond, but She kept going, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. I have nothing except Mark. I have a job I hate, no savings, no accomplishments anyone remembers. The only thing I had going for me was this engagement, this wedding, this chance to finally be something other than the daughter who could not get her life together. And now you are taking that away from me too. The accusation hit me harder than any insult she had thrown before. She saw my success as effortless, my independence as a gift rather than a survival mechanism. She had no idea about the lonely nights, the sacrifices, the years I spent building something because I had nothing else. She saw strength where there was only desperation, accomplishment where there was only escape. Emily, I said quietly, I built that company because this family made me feel like I did not exist. I worked every hour I could because it was the only place I mattered. You think I never needed anyone. I needed you. I needed Mum and Dad. But I learned to stop needing because needing only led to disappointment. For a moment, something shifted in Emily's expression. A flicker of recognition, maybe even the beginning of understanding. But before either of us could say anything more, Mark moved. He stood up abruptly from where he had been sitting, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face had transformed from panic to something uglier, something cornered and vicious. This is touching, he spat, his voice rising to a shout. Really heartwarming family drama, but I am not the only one with secrets in this family. Mark was on his feet now, his whole body vibrating with barely contained fury. The charming mask he wore so well had slipped, entirely revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. He pointed his finger directly at me, his hand shaking. You want to talk about secrets? He shouted. Fine, let us talk about why I really came to your precious office. He turned to face my mother, then back to me. I came because I heard Patricia mention at dinner last month that she had just inherited $500,000 from her mother. $500,000 sitting in a bank account waiting to be invested. The room went very still. My mother's face drained of colour. Emily stopped crying and stared at Mark with growing horror. I thought I could get to investment capital from a successful CEO. Mark continued, his voice growing louder, more frantic. I did my research. Daniel's Financial had the resources I needed. I had no idea the CEO was the sister this family pretends does not exist. The one nobody talks about. The one who was not even invited to Christmas dinner. He was pacing now, gesturing wildly, too caught up in his own rage to realise what he was revealing. Do you know how surprised I was when I walked into that lobby and saw Erin behind the desk? I almost had a heart attack. Not because of her stupid job rejection from years ago, but because suddenly everything I had planned was at risk. Mark, Emily said weakly, but he was not listening. I thought I had more time, he kept going. I thought I could secure the investment, pay off some debts, stabilise things before anyone noticed. But then your sister had to play detective. She had to dig into my past. She had to ruin everything. The silence that followed his outburst was absolute. Mark stood there, chest heaving, and I watched as realisation slowly crept across his face. He had just admitted in front of my entire family that he came to my office because of my mother's inheritance. He had just confessed that his interest in this family was financial. I mean, he stammered, trying to recover, I love Emily. That is real. The money was just, I needed help, that is all. It was not about taking anything from anyone. I just thought, if I could get access to some capital. Access to capital. My mother repeated, her voice hollow. From my inheritance? No, I mean yes, but not like that. Mark was floundering now, drowning in his own words. I love your daughter. I want to marry her. The money was just a way to solve my problems so we could have a good life together. That is all I wanted. A good life with Emily. Nobody believed him. I could see it in their faces. The charm that had worked so well for so long had finally failed him. He was exposed, stripped of his pretenses, standing in the middle of a room full of people who could finally see him for what he was. And then my father stood up. Robert Daniels had been sitting on that sofa for the entire confrontation, watching, without speaking, his face carefully neutral. I had grown so accustomed to his silence over the years that I had almost forgotten he was there. But now he rose to his full height, and when he spoke, his voice was low and steady, in a way I had not heard since I was a child. "That is enough." Everyone turned to look at him. Mark, Emily, my mother, me. We all stared as my father walked slowly toward the centre of the room, his eyes fixed on Mark with an intensity that made the younger man take a step backward. "I have watched you," my father said quietly. "From the moment you entered this family, I have watched you. The way you look at my wife whenever she mentions money, the way your eyes light up when she talks about investments or savings or inheritance. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself you were just interested in financial planning. But I knew something was wrong. I knew in my gut." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but my father held up his hand. "I did not have proof," he continued, "and in this family, we do not make accusations without proof. So I stayed quiet. I watched and I waited, and I hoped I was wrong." He turned to look at me, and something in his expression made my heart clench. "But my daughter has proof. My daughter did what I was too afraid to do." For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something I had not seen from my father in 20 years. Pride. Real, genuine pride mixed with what looked almost like shame for all the years he had failed to show it. "Erin," he said, his voice still low, but now carrying a weight of authority I had forgotten he possessed. "Show us everything you have about his past." I nodded, not trusting my voice. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick folder Daniel and I had assembled. Pages and pages of evidence, testimonies, financial records, newspaper clippings, everything we had gathered over the past 2 weeks. I set the folder on the table and opened it to the first page. "Mark Harrison has done this before," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "4 times that we know of. 4 elderly women, all living alone, all widowed or divorced, all isolated from family members who might have warned them. He targeted them specifically because they were vulnerable. And he took everything they had." I spread the contents of the folder across the dining table, covering the pristine white tablecloth, with photographs and documents and printed testimonies. The Christmas centerpiece sat incongruously among the evidence-red ornaments glinting beside bank statements that told stories of stolen lives. Margaret Wells. I began pointing to the first set of documents. She was 64 years old when Mark approached her at a community event. Her husband had just died. She was grieving, confused about finances, desperate for guidance. Mark promised to help her invest her retirement savings wisely. She gave him $200,000. 6 months later, he disappeared with everything. I moved to the next pile. Linda Park, 68, a retired school teacher who had saved carefully her entire career. Mark convinced her to let him manage her investments. She nearly lost her home. The only reason she did not end up on the street was because her son discovered what was happening and intervened before Mark could drain the last of her accounts. My mother had sunk into a chair, her hand pressed against her chest. Emily stood, frozen tears streaming silently down her face. My father remained standing, his eyes fixed on Mark with an expression of cold fury. "Dorothy Kim," I continued, 63, she had planned to retire and travel to finally enjoy the life she had worked so hard for. After Mark took her money, she had to go back to work. She is still working now at 63 as a cashier at a grocery store because she has nothing left. I picked up the final set of documents. Ruth Simmons, 66. Her husband died 2 years after they were defrauded. He went to his grave believing he had provided for his wife that she would be comfortable for the rest of her life. She never told him the truth because she could not bear to break his heart. She buried him, thinking everything was fine, and then she buried their savings along with their dreams. The room was completely silent. Even Mark had stopped protesting, standing pale and motionless near the fireplace. All of his victims share the same profile, I said, looking directly at my mother. Elderly women, widowed or single, trusting, isolated from family members who might have asked hard questions or recognized the warning signs. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Sound familiar? Mum? My mother's face went from pale to grey. I watched as realization crept across her features, watched as she began connecting dots she had never thought to connect before. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat. The conversations, she whispered almost to herself. He kept asking about my financial plans. He said he knew people who could help me grow my inheritance. He offered to introduce me to investment advisors to help me manage the money so I would not have to worry about it. What did you tell him? My father asked sharply. I told him about the inheritance, about how much it was, about how I was not sure what to do with it because Harold had always handled our investments. She looked up at me, horror dawning in her eyes. I fit the profile. I am 62. I trust easily, and I just inherited $500,000. You were his next target, I said quietly. Emily was never the goal. You were. She was just the door he needed to get inside this family. Mark finally moved. He took a sudden step toward the front door, his body coiling like a spring about to release. But my father was faster. He stepped into Mark's path, blocking the exit with his body. Sit down, my father said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight of authority I had not heard from him in decades. Mark hesitated, looking between my father and the door. For a moment I thought he might try to push past, might try to physically force his way out. But something in my father's expression made him reconsider. Robert Daniels was 65 years old, but he was still a large man, and right now he looked like someone who would not mind throwing a punch. Mark sat down on the edge of the sofa, his shoulders slumped in defeat. All the charm, all the confidence, all the careful performance he had maintained for months had evaporated. He looked small now, pathetic, like a cornered animal with nowhere left to run. Emily had not moved throughout my presentation. She stood in the same spot, arms wrapped around herself, tears still falling. But now, she stepped forward, moving toward Mark with slow, deliberate steps. Everything you said, she whispered, her voice cracking. Every time you told me you loved me. Every time you held my hand and talked about our future together. Every plan we made for the wedding, for children, for growing old together. She stopped in front of him, looking down at the man she had planned to marry. It was all about money, was it not? I was never anything to you except a way to get to my mother. Mark looked up at her, and for a moment I thought I saw something genuine flicker across his face. Regret, maybe, or just the understanding that he had lost everything. Emily, he began. But before he could finish, headlights swept across the living room window. Bright beams cut through the holiday darkness, followed by the sound of car doors opening and closing. Footsteps on the front path. And then a firm knock on the door. The police had arrived. My father moved to answer the door, his steps measured and deliberate. The rest of us remained frozen in place, a tableau of shock and devastation, ranged around the Christmas tree. Mark had not moved from the sofa. He sat with his head bowed, hands clasped between his knees, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The door opened to reveal 2 uniformed officers flanking a woman in a dark coat. Detective Sarah Miller stepped into the foyer, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the room and taking in every detail. The scattered documents on the dining table, the broken glass still glittering on the floor near the fireplace, the pale faces of my family. and Mark sitting defeated among the ruins of his carefully constructed lies. "Mr. Daniels," Detective Miller said, nodding to my father. Then her gaze found me. "Miss Daniels, I see you started without us." "The situation required it," I replied quietly. The detective walked into the living room, the two officers following close behind. She stopped a few feet from Mark and looked down at him with an expression that held no sympathy. "Mark Harrison." He did not look up. "Yes. I am Detective Sarah Miller. We have a warrant to detain you for questioning regarding multiple charges of elder financial abuse." Her voice was calm and professional, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. She had been waiting 8 years for this moment. "4 victims have provided testimony and documentary evidence connecting you to a pattern of fraud targeting vulnerable elderly women. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them?" Mark finally raised his head. His face was blank, emptied of all the emotion and manipulation that had defined him. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. One of the officers stepped forward and gently pulled Mark to his feet. The other produced a pair of handcuffs. Mark did not resist as they turned him around and secured his wrists behind his back. He moved like a man in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare going through motions that no longer connected to any sense of reality. I watched the handcuffs close around the wrists of the man who had terrorized Margaret Wells, the man who had nearly destroyed Linda Park and Dorothy Kim and Ruth Simmons, the man who had planned to do the same to my mother while pretending to love my sister. There should have been triumph in this moment, satisfaction, the sweet taste of justice finally served. But all I felt was a heavy, complicated sadness. Emily made a sound beside me, something between a gasp and a sob. She had risen from her chair without my noticing, and now she stood watching as the officers guided Mark toward the door. Her face was wet with tears, her body trembling. The man she had planned to marry, the future she had clung to so desperately, was being led away in handcuffs on Christmas morning. "Mark," she whispered, but he did not turn around. The officers walked him past the Christmas tree, past the presents that would now go unopened, past the dining table set for a celebration that would never happen. Detective Miller followed, pausing briefly at the door to look back at me. "We will need statements from everyone," she said. "I will send someone tomorrow. For now, try to have as peaceful a Christmas as you can." The words seemed almost absurd given the circumstances, but I nodded. "Thank you, Detective." She gave me a small, tight smile. "Thank you, Ms. Daniels. Without your investigation, he might have gotten away with it again." Then they were gone. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and the house fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Emily collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs, the sound muffled but still heartbreaking. Whatever anger I had felt toward her, whatever resentment had built up over years of rejection and cruelty, melted away in that moment. She was not the favoured daughter who had everything handed to her. She was a 30-year-old woman whose entire world had just shattered, who had built her self-worth on a foundation of lies, and was now watching it crumble. My mother stood near the window, watching through the glass as the police car pulled away from the curb. The lights were no longer flashing, but I could see the silhouette of Mark in the back seat, head bowed, disappearing into the grey winter morning. She watched until the car turned the corner and vanished from sight. Then she turned to face me. Something had changed in her expression. The anger that had greeted me at the door was gone. The defensiveness that had defined our relationship for 20 years had cracked open, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. She looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, as if all the years of overlooking and dismissing me had been stripped away in a single morning. "You knew," she said softly. You knew what he was and you came here anyway, even though we told you to stay away, even though Emily said those terrible things to you on the phone." Her voice caught. "You came to protect us." I did not know what to say. I had imagined this moment so many times, the moment when my family would finally see me, finally understand what I had sacrificed and achieved and endured. But now that it was here, I felt only exhaustion and a strange, empty ache. My mother took a step toward me, then another. Her eyes were wet, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "Erin," she whispered, and there was something in her voice I had not heard since I was a very young child. Something like wonder, something like regret. "How long have you known?" I looked at my mother and felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on both of us. Her question hung in the air, waiting for an answer I was not sure how to give. How long had I known about Mark? 2 weeks. But how long had I known that something was broken in this family my entire life? "I found out about Mark on December 12th, I said finally. "The day he came to my office. Everything after that was investigation and preparation." My mother nodded slowly, absorbing this information. Then she moved to the sofa and sat down heavily, as if her legs could no longer support her. She suddenly looked much older than her 62 years, the lines on her face deeper, the light in her eyes dimmer. Emily remained curled in the corner of the same sofa, still crying, softly, but she looked up as our mother began to speak. "I owe you an explanation," my mother said, her voice rough. "One I should have given you decades ago, one I could barely admit to myself." She paused, gathering herself, and I saw her hands twist together in her lap. "I need you to understand why things became the way they did, not as an excuse. There is no excuse for what I did to you, but maybe understanding will help." I did not sit down. I remained standing near the dining table, keeping a careful distance, not ready to bridge the gap between us with physical proximity. But I listened. "When Emily was born," my mother began, "the doctors told us she had a heart defect. Something wrong with one of the valves. They said she would need surgery, but she was too small, too weak. They had to wait until she was strong enough to survive the procedure." I remembered fragments of this story, whispered conversations between my parents when they thought I was asleep, the constant trips to the hospital, the way my mother would cry at night when she thought no one could hear. "She spent 3 months in the NICU," my mother continued. 3 months of machines and tubes and alarms that went off in the middle of the night. Twice they told us to prepare ourselves. Twice they said she might not make it through the night." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment before continuing. "I sat by her incubator every day, watching her tiny chest rise and fall, terrified that each breath would be her last." Emily had stopped crying. She was watching our mother with wide eyes, hearing details she had apparently never known. "When she finally came home, I could not stop watching her," my mother said. "Every cough, every fever, every moment of fussiness sent me into a panic. I was convinced that if I looked away, if I stopped being vigilant for even a second, she would slip away from me. I became obsessed with protecting her, with keeping her safe, with making sure nothing bad ever happened to my miracle baby." She looked up at me, then her eyes wet with tears. "And you, Erin, you were only 5 years old, but you were so strong, so independent. You had always been that way even as a toddler. You did not cry when you fell down. You did not need to be held constantly. You figured things out on your own and never asked for help." I felt something twist in my chest. I remembered being that little girl, remembered learning early that crying did not bring comfort, that asking for attention only led to being told to wait, that the only reliable person in my world was myself. I told myself you did not need me the way Emily did, my mother continued, her voice cracking. I told myself you were fine, that you were thriving, that my attention was better spent on the daughter who might not survive without it. But the truth is, she broke down, then tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking. The truth is, I was so focused on keeping Emily alive that I forgot you were alive too. I forgot that you were just a little girl who needed her mother. I forgot that being strong did not mean you did not hurt. The words hit me like waves against a shore, eroding defences I had built over decades. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to her and collapse into the embrace I had craved for 20 years. But I did none of those things. I stood still and let myself feel the pain without drowning in it. "I am so sorry, Erin," my mother sobbed. "I am so sorry for every birthday I missed, every achievement I did not celebrate, every time I made you feel invisible. I was trying to save one daughter and I destroyed my relationship with the other. And the worst part is, I did not even realise it. I did not see what I was doing until it was too late." I took a slow breath. The anger I had carried for so long was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a fire and more like embers. Understanding why something happened did not make it hurt less, but it did make it feel less personal. My mother had not rejected me out of malice. She had rejected me out of fear, out of trauma, out of a desperate attempt to protect a fragile child that had consumed everything else in her life. "I hear you, Mum," I said quietly, "and I understand now in a way I did not before. But hearing an explanation is not the same as healing. You cannot undo 20 years of neglect with one conversation. I needed you when I was 10 and won the spelling bee. I needed you when I was 15 and got that scholarship. I needed you every Christmas and birthday, and ordinary Tuesday when I felt alone in a house full of people." My mother nodded, tears still falling. I know I cannot fix it with words. I needed you to know that it was never because I did not love you. I loved you so much, Erin. I just showed it in the worst possible way." The room fell silent. Emily was staring at the floor, processing everything she had heard. My mother sat with her head bowed, waiting for a forgiveness I was not yet ready to give. And then my father cleared his throat. "There is something I have never told anyone," he said slowly. "Not even your mother." Everyone turned to look at my father. He stood near the window where my mother had watched the police car drive away, his hands clasped behind his back, his face drawn with an emotion I could not immediately identify. He had always been the quiet one in our family, the one who stayed in the background while my mother made decisions and Emily demanded attention. I had grown so accustomed to his silence that I had stopped expecting anything else from him. But now he was looking directly at me, and his eyes were red. 20 years ago, he began slowly, "When you won that scholarship at 15, I wanted to throw you a celebration party. A real party with your friends, with cake, with all the attention you deserved for achieving something remarkable." I remembered that scholarship. I remembered the letter arriving in the mail, the disbelief that I had actually earned a full ride to college, the excitement that had quickly turned to disappointment when no one seemed to care. "I argued with your mother," my father continued. "I told her this was a big moment for you, that we needed to celebrate properly. She said Emily was sick again, that it was not the right time, that we could do something small later." He paused, his jaw tightening. I pushed back. For once in my life, I actually pushed back. I told her that Emily being sick did not mean we could ignore our other daughter. My mother was staring at him with a mixture of surprise and something like shame. Clearly, she remembered this argument differently, or perhaps she had forgotten it entirely. "That night," my father said, his voice growing rougher, "Emily had a seizure. Her fever spiked suddenly, and before we knew what was happening, she was convulsing on the floor. We called an ambulance. We spent hours at the hospital. And when we finally got home, when Emily was stable and sleeping, your mother turned to me and said..." He stopped, closing his eyes for a moment. She said, "See, this is what happens when we take our eyes off her. Emily needs me. She needs us. And you wanted to throw a party." The room was completely silent. I could hear the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, measuring out seconds that felt like hours. From that moment, my father continued, I stopped fighting. I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. I told myself that if I just went along with whatever your mother wanted, everything would be fine. Emily would be safe, your mother would be calm, and you... He looked at me, and I saw the tears finally spill over. You were so strong, Erin. You never complained. You never demanded anything. You just kept going, kept achieving, kept building a life for yourself without any help from us. I told myself that meant you were okay, that you did not need what Emily needed. He stepped away from the window and walked toward me. His movements were slow, almost hesitant, as if he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. I watched you being pushed aside for 20 years, he said, stopping a few feet in front of me. I watched your mother prioritize Emily over and over again. I watched you fade into the background of our family until you were practically invisible. And I knew it was wrong. I knew I should have spoken up, should have fought for you, should have been the father you deserved. His voice cracked and he had to pause to collect himself. But I was a coward. I chose peace over justice. I chose quiet over conflict. I chose to protect myself from your mother's anger instead of protecting you from her neglect. He reached up and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I am so sorry, Erin. I failed you. I failed you as a father, and I have no excuse. I stood frozen, unable to speak. For 20 years, I had believed my father simply did not care enough to stand up for me. I had told myself he was weak, passive, complicit in my mother's favoritism, and he was all of those things. But hearing him admit it, hearing him take responsibility for his failure, stirred something in me that I had not expected to feel. He closed the distance between us and put his arms around me. I cannot remember the last time my father hugged me. It might have been when I was a teenager, or perhaps even younger. At some point, physical affection had simply stopped, replaced by awkward waves and stiff handshakes at family gatherings I was barely invited to. But now his arms were around me and he was holding me the way he should have held me all those years ago. I should have protected you, he whispered into my hair. I should have been your father. I should have told you every single day how proud I was of everything you accomplished. I should have celebrated you even when your mother would not. I should have been there. I felt something break open inside me, some wall I had built so long ago that I had forgotten it existed. Tears spilled down my cheeks and I found myself hugging him back, holding on to him like the little girl I used to be, the one who just wanted her daddy to tell her she mattered. We stood like that for a long moment, father and daughter finally bridging a gap that had grown too wide for too long. When we finally pulled apart, his hands remained on my shoulders, his eyes searching my face. I cannot undo what I failed to do, he said quietly, but I can promise to do better. From this day forward, I will be the father you always needed, if you will let me. I nodded, not trusting my voice to speak. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Movement caught my eye and I turned to see Emily rising from the sofa. She had been watching us, tears streaming down her face, her expression a mixture of grief and longing and something that might have been hope. She took a hesitant step toward me, then another, her hands clasped in front of her like a supplicant approaching an altar. Erin, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, can you ever forgive me? I looked at my sister, the golden child, the favoured daughter, the one who had been protected and prioritised and cherished while I faded into the background. She stood before me, now broken and desperate mascara streaking down her cheeks, her perfect Christmas outfit wrinkled from hours of crying. She wanted forgiveness. She wanted me to tell her everything was okay, that I understood that we could move forward, as if the past 20 years had not happened. But I could not give her that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You want forgiveness, I said slowly. But do you even know what you need forgiveness for? Emily blinked, confusion flickering across her face. For everything, for how I treated you, for believing Mark over you, for all of it. I shook my head. That is too easy, Emily. All of it does not mean anything. If you want forgiveness, you have to understand exactly what you did. You have to look at every wound you inflicted and acknowledge each one. She flinched, but she did not look away. Okay, tell me. I want to understand. I took a breath, steadying myself. This was the conversation I had imagined having for years, the one where I finally said all the things I had swallowed down and buried. Now that the moment was here, the words felt heavy in my mouth, each one carrying the weight of accumulated pain. You knew, I began. You knew I was being pushed aside. You were not a baby anymore when it started happening. You were old enough to see that Mum dropped everything for you while I was left to figure things out alone. You saw me sitting by myself at family dinners while everyone fussed over you. You heard Mum dismiss my achievements while celebrating yours. Emily's face crumpled, but I kept going. And you benefited from it. You let Mum buy you things while I worked after-school jobs. You let Dad drive you to events while I took the bus. You accepted every advantage that came from being the favourite, and you never once stopped to ask if it was fair. You never once stood up and said, "What about Erin?" Tears were streaming down her face now, but she did not interrupt. She stood there and took it, which was more than I had expected. When Mark wanted me gone from Christmas, I continued, "You did not hesitate. You sent that message to the group chat without a second thought. You called me a stranger. You laughed about it with Mum and Dad. You did not even consider that maybe, just maybe, I deserved to be there too." "I am so sorry," Emily whispered. "I did not think." "No, you did not." I agreed. "You never thought about me. I was just the inconvenient older sister who made things complicated. And when I called you to warn you about Mark, when I tried to protect you from a man who was going to destroy your life, you chose him. You chose a man you knew was lying over a sister who never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air between us, each one a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room. My mother sat motionless on the sofa, her face wet with tears. My father stood nearby, his expression pained but unsurprised. They had both heard pieces of this before, but never all at once, never laid out so starkly. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small box I had carried with me for 17 years. The wrapping paper was faded and soft from age, the tape yellowed and cracked. But the words written on it were still legible, the handwriting of an 18-year-old girl who had believed love could fix anything. When I was 18, I said, my voice catching despite my best efforts to stay composed, I saved money for an entire year. Every shift at the bookstore, every bit of overtime I could get, went into a fund for one purpose. I wanted to buy you a Christmas gift. Something special. Something that would show you how much I loved you, even though we had grown apart. Emily stared at the box in my hands, recognition dawning on her face. The night I tried to give it to you, I continued. I was so nervous. I had wrapped it myself, written your name on it, practiced what I was going to say. I came to your room after dinner, and I held it out to you, and I said, "Merry Christmas, Emily. I love you." My voice broke, and I had to pause to collect myself. The memory was still vivid, still painful, even after all these years. You looked at me like I was bothering you, like I was some kind of annoyance you had to deal with, and you said... I stopped, the words catching in my throat. "Stop trying so hard, Erin. I do not need you." Emily made a small wounded sound. "You did not even take the gift," I said. "You just turned away and went back to whatever you were doing." And I stood there holding this box, feeling like the biggest fool in the world for thinking my little sister might actually want to be close to me. I stepped forward and placed the unopened box in Emily's hands. She looked down at it, her fingers trembling as they touched the faded paper. She turned it over and saw the words I had written all those years ago in careful teenage script to my dearest little sister. "I have carried this for 17 years, I said quietly. Through college, through graduate school, through building my company from nothing. Through every holiday I spent alone every birthday. No one remembered every Christmas where I was not welcome. I carried it because some part of me kept hoping that one day things would be different. That one day you would want me to be your sister." Emily was sobbing now, clutching the box to her chest like it might disappear if she let go. Her whole body shook with the force of her crying grief and regret and shame all pouring out at once. "What is inside?" She finally managed to ask, her voice barely audible through her tears. "Erin, what is inside?" Emily looked down at the box in her hands, her fingers tracing the faded letters of my teenage handwriting. For a long moment she did not move, as if afraid that opening it would make everything too real. Then slowly, carefully, she began to peel back the yellowed tape. The wrapping paper fell away in pieces brittle from 17 years of waiting. Inside was a small velvet jewellery box, the kind you might find at any department store. It was nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just a simple black box that had held my 18-year-old hopes and dreams for a relationship with my sister. Emily lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded cotton, was a silver bracelet, simple and delicate, with a thin chain that caught the Christmas lights and sparkled softly. Attached to the chain were 2 small charms, each engraved with a single letter, E and E, Erin and Emily. Tucked beneath the bracelet was a small piece of paper, folded carefully into quarters. Emily set the box down and unfolded the note with trembling hands. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible. The handwriting unmistakably mine from a time when I still believed in happy endings. Emily read the words aloud, her voice breaking on every syllable. "Dear little sister, no matter what the world forgets, I will always remember you. We are bound by blood, by love, by the letters of our names. Merry Christmas forever. Love, always your big sister, Erin." The room fell completely silent. Even the Christmas tree seemed to stop twinkling, as if the whole house was holding its breath. Emily clutched the bracelet in one hand and the note in the other, and then something inside her shattered. She collapsed to her knees on the carpet, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. These were not the tears she had cried earlier, the ones born of shock and betrayal. These were deeper roar, pulled from some place she had kept locked away for years. She was crying for the sister she had rejected, for the love she had thrown away, for all the years she had spent treating me like an inconvenience when I had been holding on to hope for both of us. My mother rose from the sofa and moved toward Emily, but she did not try to comfort her. Instead, she stood and watched her own tears streaming silently down her face. She was seeing, perhaps for the first time, the full cost of the favoritism she had created. The golden child she had protected so fiercely was kneeling on the floor, broken by the realization that she had destroyed something precious without even knowing it existed. My father had turned away, one hand pressed against his face. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs, the sound muffled but unmistakable. The man who had stayed silent for 20 years was finally letting himself feel the weight of what that silence had cost. And I stood there watching my family cry, feeling something crack open inside my own chest. I had built walls around my heart so high and so thick that I had convinced myself nothing could get through. I had told myself I did not need their love, their approval, their presence in my life. I had survived alone for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than myself. But standing here now, watching Emily cradle the bracelet I had bought with a year's worth of bookstore wages, I felt tears on my own cheeks. I had not cried over this family in years. I had not allowed myself to feel the pain because feeling it would have destroyed me. But now, in this moment, surrounded by the wreckage of secrets and lies and finally the truth, I let myself grieve for everything we had lost. Emily looked up at me from the floor, her face swollen and red, the bracelet clutched against her heart. "I do not deserve this. She whispered. "After everything I did, after everything I said, I do not deserve this gift." I knelt down in front of her, bringing myself to her level. "No," I agreed quietly. "You do not." She flinched, but she did not look away. "But I did not buy it because you deserved it," I continued. "I bought it because I loved you, because you were my little sister, and I wanted you to know that no matter what happened, no matter how much Mum favoured you or how invisible I became, we would always be connected. E and E, two letters that belong together." Emily's hand shook as she lifted the bracelet. Is it okay if I nodded. She fastened the bracelet around her wrist with trembling fingers. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for the moment when she would finally be ready to wear it. She held up her arm and looked at the two small charms glinting in the light, then looked back at me. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice raw. "I know those words are not enough. I know I cannot undo what I did. But I am sorry, Erin. I am sorry for all of it." I did not say it was okay, because it was not. I did not say I forgave her, because I was not sure I did. But I reached out and took her hand, the one with the bracelet, and I held it for a moment. "Some part of me still loves you," I said. "Some part of me never stopped. I do not know if we can fix what is broken between us. But maybe we can try?" Emily squeezed my hand and nodded, unable to speak through her tears. My mother had moved closer, watching this exchange with an expression I could not quite read. When Emily and I finally released each other's hands, she stepped forward, her own face still wet. "Erin," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "after everything we have done to you, after all the years of neglect and favouritism and treating you like you did not matter." She paused, struggling to find the words. "How can you still have love left? How can you still care about us at all?" My mother's question hung in the air, heavy with decades of unspoken pain. How could I still have love left? How could I care about a family that had treated me as an afterthought for 20 years? It was a fair question, one I had asked myself countless times during lonely nights in empty apartments. I moved to an armchair near the window and sat down. My legs were tired from standing, and something in me had shifted. The defensive walls I had maintained throughout this confrontation were beginning to crumble, not from weakness, but from exhaustion. I had spent so much energy protecting myself that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply be honest. "You see, strength, I said slowly, looking at my mother, then my father, then Emily. "All of you have always seen strength when you looked at me. The independent daughter, the one who did not need anything, the one who figured everything out on her own." I paused, letting the words settle. "But I did not see strength. I saw survival. I was not strong. I just had no other choice." My mother started to speak, but I held up my hand. "Let me finish. Please. I have been silent for 20 years. I need you to hear this." She nodded and sat back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "When I left for college," I continued, "I thought things would get better. I thought distance would help, that being away from this house would give me room to breathe. But it did not work that way. Every holiday, I would watch the other students pack their bags and head home to families that wanted them there. I would hear them talking about Christmas traditions and Thanksgiving dinners and summer vacations. And I would sit alone in my dorm room, pretending I had chosen to stay because I had work to do. The memory was still sharp even after all these years. I could picture the empty hallways of my dormitory, the silence that felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. "I cried every holiday," I said quietly. "Not in front of anyone. Never in front of anyone. But at night, When no one could see, I would curl up in my bed and cry until I had nothing left. I cried because I missed you. All of you. I cried because I wanted to come home, but I knew that home did not really want me. Emily made a small sound, but I kept going. The words were flowing now, released from whatever locked box I had kept them in for so long. I worked 3 jobs during college. Not because I needed the money for tuition, the scholarship covered that, but because working meant I did not have to think. Working meant I had something to do during holidays, when everyone else went home. Working meant I could fall into bed exhausted every night and not lie awake wondering why my own family did not love me enough to include me. I looked down at my hands, noticing for the first time that they were trembling slightly. I graduated a year early, not because I was some kind of genius, but because I could not stand the thought of another empty Christmas in that dormitory. I threw myself into my studies the same way I threw myself into work, using achievement as a shield against the loneliness. My father had moved closer, standing near my mother, now his hand resting on her shoulder. They were both crying silently, but I could not stop to comfort them. Not yet. When I started building my company, I continued, people thought I was driven by ambition. They saw a young woman climbing the corporate ladder, making deals, taking risks, achieving things that people twice my age had not accomplished. They called me impressive. They called me inspiring. They had no idea that I was just running from the feeling that I was invisible, running from the silence of holidays spent alone, running from the voice in my head that said, maybe my family was right, maybe I did not matter, maybe I really was nothing. I finally looked up and met my mother's eyes. I became CEO at 32 because work was the only place I felt valued. In my office, people listened when I spoke. They respected my opinions. They noticed when I walked into a room. I built that company into something successful. Not because I wanted wealth or power, but because I desperately needed to prove to myself that I existed, that I mattered, that I was not the nothing you made me feel like every time you forgot my birthday, or excluded me from holidays, or talked over me at dinner. The room was completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of the house seemed to have faded away, as if the walls themselves were listening. Every time I was excluded from this family, I said, my voice growing stronger, I worked harder. Every time Emily got celebrated while I got overlooked, I pushed myself further. But I was not trying to prove anything to you. I gave up on that years ago. I was trying to prove something to myself. I was trying to build a life where my worth did not depend on whether or not my mother remembered to call me on my birthday. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the grey Christmas morning. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world covered in a thin white blanket that made everything look clean and new. So, when you ask how I still have love left, I said, turning back to face them, the answer is simple. Love was never the problem. I have always had love to give. I loved Emily when we were children, when I used to read her stories and comfort her during thunderstorms. I loved Mum and Dad, even when they forgot I existed. I loved this family, even when being part of it felt like standing outside a warm house, in the cold, watching everyone else through the window. I took a breath, feeling the weight of the words I was about to say. The problem was never that I did not have enough love. The problem was that no one in this family wanted to receive it from me. I kept reaching out and you kept pushing me away, until eventually I stopped reaching. Not because I stopped loving you, but because I could not survive the rejection anymore. My mother covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. My father wrapped his arm around her, his own face wet with tears. And Emily sat on the floor, still clutching the bracelet, looking at me with an expression that held equal parts devastation and dawning understanding. Before anyone could respond, my phone rang. The sound cut through the heavy silence like a knife, jarring and unexpected. I pulled it from my pocket and saw Daniel's name on the screen. I have to take this? I said, stepping away from the window. I answered the call, turning slightly away from my family. Daniel, Erin. His voice was tight with barely contained energy. I just got off the phone with Detective Miller. There is news about Mark. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my heart pounding. Behind me, I could feel my family watching, waiting, sensing that whatever Daniel was about to tell me would matter. What kind of news? I asked, keeping my voice steady. The kind we were hoping for, Daniel said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his tone. Mark confessed to everything. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. After everything that had happened, after all the lies and manipulation and pain, Mark Harrison had finally admitted the truth. His lawyer advised him to plead guilty, Daniel continued. Once Detective Miller laid out all the evidence, the testimonies from 4 victims, the financial records, the pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly women, Mark's attorney knew they could not win at trial. A jury would have torn him apart, so they negotiated. Mark admitted to elder financial abuse and wire fraud in exchange for avoiding additional charges. What does that mean for his sentence? I asked. With over $400,000 in documented fraud and multiple victims across state lines, he is looking at 5 years in federal prison. That is the minimum. If he had gone to trial and lost, he could have faced up to 20. Daniel paused. The judge also ordered full restitution. Mark's remaining assets, his apartment, his car, whatever savings he has hidden away, all of it will be liquidated to compensate his victims. I thought of Margaret Wells, sitting alone in her small apartment, waiting for 8 years for someone to believe her. I thought of Linda Park and Dorothy Kim and Ruth Simmons, women who had lost their security and their dignity to a man who saw them as nothing more than targets. Will it be enough, I asked, to make them whole? Daniel sighed. Probably not. Mark spent most of what he stole, and his remaining assets are not worth anywhere near what he took. But it is something, and more importantly, it is acknowledgement. These women will finally have legal recognition that they were victims of a crime. That matters, Erin. It matters a lot. I nodded, even though he could not see me. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. There is one more thing, he said. I got a text from Margaret Wells about an hour ago. She asked me to pass along a message to you. What did she say? Daniel's voice softened. She said, "Tell Erin I can finally sleep peacefully for the first time in 8 years. She was my angel twice. Once when I lost everything, and once when she made sure he could not hurt anyone else. Something in my chest loosened a knot I had not even realised I was carrying." Margaret Wells had waited 8 years for justice. 8 years of wondering if anyone would ever hold Mark accountable. And now, finally, she could rest. "I will call her tomorrow," I said, "to check on her." "I think she would like that." Daniel paused. "Get some rest, Erin. You did good work. You saved your family and got justice for 4 women who had given up hope. That is not nothing." We said our goodbyes, and I ended the call, turning back to face my family. They were all watching me with varying expressions of anticipation and anxiety, waiting to hear what I had learned. "Mark confessed," I said simply, "to everything. Elder financial abuse, wire fraud, all of it. He is going to prison for at least 5 years, and his assets will be seized to compensate his victims." My mother let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. My father closed his eyes and nodded slowly. But it was Emily's reaction that caught my attention. She was looking at me differently than she ever had before. The jealousy and resentment that had coloured our relationship for so long were gone, replaced by something I could not immediately identify. It took me a moment to recognise it as admiration, genuine, unguarded admiration. "You did all of this," Emily said quietly. "You investigated him. You found the victims. You built the case. You coordinated with the police. You did all of that in 2 weeks." "I had help," I said. "Daniel did most of the legal work. Detective Miller handled the law enforcement side. I just connected the pieces. Emily shook her head. Do not do that. Do not minimize what you accomplished. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked toward me. You could have walked away. After how I treated you after that phone call, where I said all those horrible things, you had every right to let me marry him and suffer the consequences. No one would have blamed you. I did not say anything. She was not wrong. But you did not walk away, Emily continued. You kept going. You kept fighting. Not for revenge, not to prove you were right. She stopped in front of me, her eyes searching my face. You did it to protect people, did you not? I thought about it for a moment. The truth was more complicated than a simple yes or no. There had been moments during the investigation when anger had driven me, moments when I wanted Mark to suffer for what he had done to Margaret Wells and the others. But underneath that anger, underneath the pain and the resentment, there had always been something else. I did it because it was right, I said finally. Those women deserved justice. And you, I looked at my sister at the bracelet glinting on her wrist. You deserved to know the truth, even if you did not want to hear it from me. Emily's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she did not look away. You did it to protect me, even after everything. Yes, I admitted, including you. We stood there for a moment, the weight of that admission hanging between us. Then Emily reached out and took my hand the same way I had taken hers earlier. I want to do something meaningful, she said, her voice gaining strength, like you do. I want to help people the way you helped Margaret Wells and the others. She squeezed my hand tightly. I have spent my whole life being protected, being taken care of, being the one who receives instead of the one who gives. And look where it got me. I almost married a con artist because I was so desperate to be loved that I ignored every warning sign. She paused, gathering herself. I do not want to be that person anymore. I want to be someone who makes a difference, someone who stands up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. She looked into my eyes with an intensity I had never seen from her before. Can you teach me? Can you show me how to be strong like you? I looked at my sister at the earnestness in her eyes and the bracelet gleaming on her wrist. She was asking me to teach her how to be strong. The irony was not lost on me. For 20 years, she had been the one everyone protected while I learned strength through necessity. Now she wanted to follow a path I had walked alone. I want to volunteer, Emily said, her voice gaining conviction as she spoke, with organisations that help elderly fraud victims, people like Margaret and the others. I cannot undo what happened with Mark. I cannot give those women back the years they lost or the money he stole. But maybe I can help prevent others from going through what they did. She released my hand and began pacing, slowly working through her thoughts aloud. I can listen to people. I can be present. I can help them understand the warning signs, help them recognise when someone is trying to take advantage of them. I do not have a business degree or legal training, but I can be a voice. I can be someone who cares. It was a good impulse, a genuine one as far as I could tell. But I had seen too many people make grand declarations in moments of emotional intensity, only to forget them when the feelings faded. I did not want Emily to set herself up for failure by promising more than she could deliver. That is a good start, I said carefully. But I need you to understand something. Emily stopped pacing and turned to face me. You need to do this for yourself, I continued, not to impress me, not to make Mom proud, not to prove to anyone that you have changed. If you volunteer because you want my approval, you will burn out the first time it gets hard. And it will get hard. Working with victims means hearing painful stories. It means facing people who are scared and angry, and sometimes do not want help even when they need it. Emily nodded, slowly absorbing my words. You have spent 30 years living for other people's approval, I said. First Mum's, then Mark's, then whoever else you thought you needed to please. That is part of how you ended up in this situation. You were so desperate to be loved that you ignored every warning sign because Mark gave you the validation you craved. The words were harsh, but Emily did not flinch. She seemed to understand that I was not trying to hurt her, just trying to make sure she understood the work that lay ahead. If you really want to change, I said, you need to figure out who you actually are, not who Mum wants you to be, not who Mark pretended you were. You. What do you believe in? What matters to you? What kind of person do you want to become? I paused. Those are questions only you can answer, and answering them honestly is harder than any volunteer work you will ever do. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. You are right. I have never really thought about who I am separate from what other people want from me. I have always been Emily, the golden child, Emily, the bride-to-be, Emily, the daughter who needed protecting. She took a shaky breath. I do not even know what I like to do, what I enjoy, what I want out of life beyond a husband and children and approval. Then that is where you start, I said. Figure that out first. The volunteering can come later, once you have a foundation to build on. My mother had been listening silently from the sofa. Now, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate as if each step required conscious effort. I need to do something too, she said. I need to see a therapist. We all turned to look at her. I have spent 20 years being so afraid of losing Emily that I lost Erin instead. She continued, her voice cracking. I poured everything into protecting one daughter and completely neglected the other. I told myself I was being a good mother, but I was just being a scared one. And my fear caused damage I am only beginning to understand. She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I need help, Erin. Professional help. I need to learn why I did what I did and how to make sure I never do it again. I need to learn how to be a fair mother. She paused. Even if it is decades too late. I did not know what to say. My mother had never been the type to admit weakness or seek outside help. She had always presented herself as the strong matriarch, the one who held the family together. Hearing her acknowledge that she needed therapy was like watching a wall crumble. It is not too late, I said finally. It is late, but it is not too late. My father cleared his throat. He had been standing near the window, a silent observer for most of this conversation. But now, he stepped forward, positioning himself beside my mother. I need to make a promise too, he said. To all of you, but especially to Erin. We waited. I promised to speak up when I see something wrong, he said, his voice steady. No more silence. No more hiding behind peace to avoid conflict. No more watching my family hurt each other while I pretend everything is fine. He looked directly at me. I should have fought for you, Erin. Every time your mother overlooked you, every time Emily was prioritized, every time you were excluded from something that should have included both daughters. I should have said something. I should have been your advocate. He took a breath. I cannot change the past, but I can change the future. From now on, when I see something unfair, I will name it. When someone in this family is being hurt, I will not stay quiet. Peace bought with silence is not real peace. It is just delayed pain. The four of us stood there in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of a Christmas morning that had gone nothing like anyone expected. The tree still sparkled. The presents still sat unopened beneath it. But everything else had changed. We were broken. There was no pretending otherwise. 20 years of dysfunction could not be repaired in a single morning, no matter how many tears were shed or promises made. But for the first time, we were being honest with each other. For the first time, we were acknowledging the damage, instead of pretending it did not exist. If we are really starting over, I said slowly, there is one more thing we need to discuss. Everyone looked at me. We need boundaries. The word hung in the air between us. Boundaries. It was such a simple concept, yet in this family it had never existed. We had spent 20 years with no clear lines, no established expectations, just an unspoken hierarchy that put Emily at the centre and left me on the outside. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope. It was plain white, unremarkable, the kind you might use for a birthday card or a simple note. But what was inside had taken me years to understand and weeks to articulate. "This is my real Christmas gift to this family," I said, holding up the envelope. "Not the bracelet from 17 years ago. That was a gift from the girl I used to be, the one who still believed love alone could fix everything. This is from the woman I am now." I opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. My family watched in silence as I unfolded it. "I wrote this a few days ago," I explained. "When I was preparing to come here, I knew that even if everything went well, even if Mark was exposed and arrested, we would still have a lot of work to do. I knew that apologies and tears would not be enough to rebuild what was broken. So, I made a list of what I need from this family if we are going to have a real relationship." I looked down at my own handwriting and began to read aloud. 1. No more comparing me to Emily. We are two different people with two different lives. My success is not a reflection on her, and her choices are not a reflection on me. We each deserve to be seen as individuals, not as halves of a comparison. I glanced up. My mother was watching with an intensity I had rarely seen from her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Emily had sat down on the sofa, the bracelet catching the light every time she moved her arm. 2. Notify me of family gatherings in advance. I deserve an invitation, not an exclusion. If there is a holiday dinner or a birthday party or any family event, I should hear about it before it happens, not after. I should be given the choice to attend, not have the choice made for me. My father nodded slowly, his expression pained but accepting. 3. When I say no respect, it without guilt or pressure. If I cannot attend something, if I need space, if I choose not to participate in a particular family activity, that decision should be honoured. No passive-aggressive comments. No making me feel like I have failed some unspoken test. No is a complete sentence. I took a breath before continuing. 4. I do not owe explanations for my choices. How I live my life, who I spend time with, what I prioritise, these are my decisions. I am happy to share when I want to, but I should not feel obligated to justify myself every time I do something that does not fit your expectations. Emily's eyes were wet again, but she was nodding along with each point, as if checking off a list of all the ways she had failed me over the years. 5. I paused, making sure they were all listening. I love this family. I have always loved this family, even when that love was not returned. But love must come with respect. I will not accept being treated as less than. I will not accept being forgotten or dismissed or made to feel invisible. If we are going to have a relationship, it has to be built on mutual respect, not just obligation. I lowered the paper and looked at each of them in turn. My mother, my father, my sister. The three people who should have been my foundation, my support system, my safe harbour. Instead, they had been the source of my deepest wounds. "These are my boundaries," I said quietly. "They are not negotiable. They are not suggestions. If you want me in your lives, truly in your lives, and not just on the periphery, these are the terms." The silence stretched for several long seconds. I could see them processing, absorbing, perhaps for the first time understanding how much damage had been done and how much work would be required to repair it. My mother was the first to speak. She reached out her hand and I gave her the paper. She read through it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she took in each word. When she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "These things," she whispered, "you should not have to ask for them. Any of them. These are basic courtesies, basic respect, the kind of treatment every child deserves from their parents." Her voice broke. We should have given you these things freely without being asked. The fact that you had to write them down, that you had to present them as conditions for a relationship, tells me exactly how badly we failed you. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. I accept these boundaries, Erin, all of them, and I am so sorry that you ever had to ask. Emily stood up and moved to stand beside our mother. She took the paper from her hands and read through it herself slower than our mother had, as if committing each point to memory. I accept them too, she said when she finished, and I want to add something. She looked at me directly. I promise I will not let anyone manipulate this family again. Not Mark, not anyone who comes after him, not even myself. I will learn to ask hard questions. I will learn to see red flags instead of ignoring them. I will protect this family the way you protected us today. My father stepped forward, his hand reaching for the paper. Emily gave it to him, and he read through it with the careful attention he might give a legal document. These are fair, he said simply. More than fair, they are the minimum we should have been providing all along. He folded the paper carefully and handed it back to me. I accept them, and I will help hold everyone accountable, including myself. For the first time that day, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something like hope. We were so far from healed. The wounds were too deep and too old to close with a single conversation. But we had finally acknowledged them. We had finally named them. And we had finally agreed on what needed to change. The four of us sat down together in the living room. The Christmas tree sparkled beside us. The presents still wrapped the day, still young despite everything that had happened. We sat without the pretense that had defined our family for so long, without the hierarchy that had placed Emily at the centre and me at the margins, without the invisible walls of favouritism that had divided us into the loved and the overlooked. It was not perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was honest. And honesty was the foundation we had been missing for 20 years. My mother suddenly stood up, a strange expression on her face. "Wait here," she said, and walked toward the kitchen. We watched her go confused. When she returned a moment later, she was carrying a simple chocolate cake on a plain white plate. No fancy decorations, no elaborate frosting, just a homemade chocolate cake, the kind a mother might make for her child's birthday. "I made this yesterday," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Before everything happened, before I knew you were coming." She set the cake down on the coffee table and looked at me. "Chocolate, your favourite since you were little." She paused, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I never forgot, Erin. Even when it seemed like I did, I never forgot." I stared at the chocolate cake sitting on the coffee table. It was nothing fancy. No professional decorations or elaborate icing designs. Just a simple homemade cake, slightly lopsided on one side, with a thin layer of chocolate frosting that had been spread by hand rather than with any particular skill. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My mother remembered. Through all the years of forgetting my birthdays, overlooking my achievements, prioritising Emily, in every conceivable way she had still held on to this one small detail. Chocolate was my favourite. It had been since I was a little girl, since the days before Emily was born, and everything changed. Somewhere beneath all the fear and dysfunction, my mother had kept that memory alive. Sometimes love is hidden, not because it does not exist, but because we do not know how to express it. I understood that now. My mother had loved me. She had always loved me. She had just been so consumed by terror over Emily that she forgot how to show it. The love had been there buried under years of neglect, waiting for someone to dig it out. "Thank you," I said softly. "This means more than you know." My mother nodded, wiping her eyes. "I should have made it every year. I should have shown you instead of just feeling it." She took a shaky breath. "But I can start now, if you will let me." We cut the cake together. My father found plates in the kitchen. Emily located forks, and somehow, without anyone planning it, we found ourselves sitting around the dining table for a Christmas dinner that looked nothing like the one my mother had originally planned. There was no elaborate feast, no perfectly roasted turkey or carefully arranged side dishes. Instead, we ate chocolate cake for dinner, passing slices around the table like it was the most normal thing in the world. The Christmas tree twinkled beside us. The presents still sat unopened. And for the first time in 20 years, my family felt like a family. My father began telling stories about me when I was young, before Emily was born, before everything became complicated. He talked about the time I tried to teach myself to ride a bike and refused to let anyone help me, falling down over and over until I finally figured it out. He described the science fair project I built at age 10, a model volcano that erupted all over the kitchen ceiling. "You were always so determined," he said, his eyes warm with memories he had kept locked away for too long. I did not realise that being capable of taking care of yourself did not mean you should have to. My mother added her own memories, the songs I used to make up while I played, the stories I would tell my stuffed animals at bedtime, the look of pure joy on my face the first time I saw snow. "You were such a happy child," she said, "before I let my fear take over. You were so full of light." I had spent so long believing my mother had never truly seen me that discovering she had these memories felt like finding treasure in a place I had given up searching. After we finished the cake, I stepped outside onto the front porch. The snow had started falling again, soft white flakes drifting down from a sky that had begun to darken toward evening. The neighbourhood was quiet, most families tucked inside their warm houses. I stood alone for a moment, letting the cold air clear my head. The door opened behind me and Emily stepped out. She was wearing a coat, now her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. The silver bracelet glinted on her wrist, catching the porch light. She came to stand beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. We looked out at the falling snow together, two sisters who had spent 20 years on opposite sides of an invisible wall. "Can I wear this forever?" Emily asked, holding up her wrist so the bracelet caught the light. "I know I do not deserve it. I know I rejected it once. But can I keep it now?" I looked at her, really looked at her, not through the lens of resentment or pain. I saw my little sister, the girl who used to follow me around the house. She had not asked to be the favourite any more than I had asked to be forgotten. "It was always yours," I said. "From the moment I bought it, I never wanted anyone else to have it." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. She reached out and took my hand, her fingers cold against mine. We stood there together, watching the snowfall, two sisters separated by favouritism and dysfunction finally standing side by side. I did not expect everything to be perfect. Healing would take time. There would be setbacks and difficult conversations and moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. 20 years of damage could not be undone in a single day. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. Not because my family had suddenly become perfect, but because they had finally seen me. They had acknowledged the pain. They had committed to change. And they had shown me through a simple chocolate cake and the long-forgotten stories that I had always mattered to them. I looked up at the night sky snowflakes catching in my hair. At 35 years old, I had built an empire from nothing, saved my family from a predator, and finally been seen by the people whose eyes I had craved my entire life. I did not need them to change overnight. I only needed to know that hope existed, that things could be different. And tonight, for the first time in 20 years, I knew that hope was real. The Christmas reunion was not the end of our pain, but it was a beginning, a chance to build something new on the ruins of what had been broken. And sometimes a beginning is enough. And that is where our story ends for today. Erin Daniels walked into Christmas morning as the forgotten sister, the invisible daughter, the one her family had pushed aside for 20 years. She walked out as the woman who saved them all from a predator they never saw coming, and finally, she was seen for who she truly was. This story reminds us that strength is not always loud. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who survive in silence, who build their own foundations, when no one else will help, who keep loving, even when that love is never returned. Erin carried a gift for 17 years, waiting for a sister who once told her she was not needed. And in the end, that same sister put on the bracelet and held her hand in the falling snow. Family is complicated, forgiveness is hard, and healing does not happen overnight. But sometimes, all we need is a beginning. A single moment when the truth finally comes out, when the walls finally come down, when the people who hurt us finally see the damage they caused. That moment does not fix everything, but it opens a door that was closed for far too long. If this story touched your heart, if you found yourself thinking about your own family, your own wounds, your own moments of feeling invisible, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of Erin's journey resonated with you the most. Have you ever felt like the forgotten one in your family? Have you ever had to be strong because no one else would be strong for you? Your stories matter, and I would love to read them. And if you have not already, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. We share stories like this one every week, stories about resilience, about justice, about the complicated love that exists within families. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, sometimes a beginning is enough.